Somewhere beneath the canopy of the Petén lowlands, limestone temples still rise above the trees, their doorways opening onto plazas where no one has walked for 1,000 years. The Maya built their cities not against the jungle but within it, shaping a civilization across centuries of trade and war, astronomy and ritual, dynasty after dynasty carving their names into stone so that time itself might remember. This is a story that unfolds slowly, as all true histories do, from the first villages along riversides to the great centers of Tikal and Palenque, and eventually to the quiet that followed. If these quieter journeys through history help ease the way toward rest, subscribing means more will arrive in the weeks ahead. For now, though, the jungle waits, humid and alive with the hum of insects beneath the sky. The ancients knew by different names, and the story can begin here. Long before the great cities rose from the jungle floor, long before the stone temples climbed toward the heavens and the scribes carved their intricate glyphs into monument after monument, there existed a quieter world. A world of small settlements and careful cultivation, of families learning to coax sustenance from the tropical earth, and of communities beginning to gather in ways that would, over many centuries, grow into something remarkable. This is the story of those earliest beginnings, the slow and patient seeds of what would eventually become the Maya civilization. And it is a story that unfolds not with sudden drama, but with the gentle accumulation of generations, each one building upon the knowledge of those who came before, each one adding another layer to the foundations of a culture that would endure for thousands of years. The land that would cradle this emerging civilization stretched across what we now call southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, a region of extraordinary diversity, where limestone lowlands met volcanic highlands, where rivers carved their paths through dense tropical forests, and where the climate presented both challenges and opportunities for those who wished to make their homes there. In the Petén lowlands of what is now northern Guatemala and the adjacent areas of Belize, the environment was particularly demanding, with its seasonal rains and dry periods, its thick canopy of vegetation, and its soil that required careful management to yield reliable harvests. Yet it was precisely in these lowlands that some of the earliest Maya communities would take root, finding in the challenges of the landscape not obstacles, but invitations to develop new ways of living and working together. To understand how the Maya came to be, one must look even further back, to the cultures that preceded them and from which they drew inspiration and knowledge. The Olmec civilization, which flourished along the Gulf Coast of Mexico beginning around 1500 BCE, is often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, though scholars continue to debate the precise nature of its influence on later peoples. What is clear is that the Olmecs developed many of the practices and beliefs that would later appear among the Maya, including the carving of monumental stone heads, the construction of ceremonial centers, the practice of bloodletting rituals, and elements of a calendar system that would be refined and elaborated over subsequent centuries. The relationship between the Olmecs and the early Maya was not one of simple transmission or copying, however, but rather a complex web of exchange and adaptation, as the ancestors of the Maya took what they found useful and transformed it according to their own needs and visions. The very origins of the Maya people remain something of a scholarly mystery, one that linguists have attempted to unravel through the careful reconstruction of what they call Proto-Maya, the ancestral language from which all later Maya languages descended. By comparing the words and grammatical structures of the various Maya languages that are still spoken today, and by tracing the patterns of sound change and vocabulary shift that languages undergo over time, Linguists have been able to sketch the outlines of this ancient tongue and, through it, to glimpse something of the world in which its speakers lived. The reconstructed vocabulary of Proto-Maya suggests a people already familiar with maize agriculture, with the flora and fauna of the highland and lowland environments, and with certain social and ceremonial practices that would remain central to Maya life for millennia. This linguistic evidence points to a homeland somewhere in the highlands of Guatemala, from which groups of Maya speakers gradually dispersed over the course of many centuries, spreading north into the lowlands and east into what is now Honduras and Belize, carrying their language and their ways of life with them as they went. Among the earliest archaeological evidence for settled Maya communities is the site of Quello, located in the northern lowlands of what is now Belize, where excavations have revealed the remains of a village dating back to approximately 1200 BCE. The people who lived at Quello were no longer wanderers moving from place to place in search of food, but had instead chosen to remain in one location, building small houses of perishable materials, cultivating their fields year after year, and burying their dead in the floors beneath their homes in a practice that speaks to a deep connection between the living and those who had passed on. The structures at Quello were modest by the standards of later Maya architecture, simple platforms of plastered mud and limestone, upon which wooden and thatch buildings once stood. But they represent a crucial transition in the human story of this region. The shift from a nomadic or semi-nomadic existence to a sedentary way of life that would make possible all the developments to come. At Quello and at other early sites throughout the Maya lowlands, the foundation of this settled existence was agriculture. And at the heart of that agriculture was maize, the tall grass with its heavy cobs of starchy kernels that would become not merely a staple food, but a sacred substance woven into the very fabric of Maya belief and identity. The domestication of maize from its wild ancestor, a humble grass called teosinte, had begun thousands of years earlier in the highlands of Mexico. And by the time the Maya were establishing their first permanent villages, they had inherited a plant already transformed by countless generations of careful selection and cultivation. But the Maya did not rely on maize alone, for they had learnt to plant it alongside beans and squash in a system that later observers would call the Three Sisters, a name that captures something of the harmony and mutual support that characterizes this way of farming. The maize stalks grew tall and provided poles for the bean vines to climb, while the beans, like all legumes, drew nitrogen from the air and fixed it in the soil, enriching the earth for the next season's planting, and the squash spread its broad leaves across the ground, shading the soil and helping to retain moisture while discouraging the growth of weeds. Together, these three crops provided a balanced diet, with the proteins of the beans complementing the carbohydrates of the maize and the vitamins and minerals of the squash. And this agricultural trinity would sustain Maya communities through all the centuries of their development. As the centuries passed and the population of these early settlements grew, the Maya began to construct more substantial buildings and to organize their communities in more complex ways. At the site of Ceiba, located along the Pasión River in the Petén region of Guatemala, archaeologists have found evidence of public ceremonial platforms dating to approximately 950 BCE, indicating that by this time the Maya were already gathering for collective rituals and were investing significant labor in the construction of spaces dedicated to activities that transcended the daily concerns of individual households. The platforms at Ceiba were not yet the towering pyramids that would later characterize Maya cities, but they were a beginning, a first step toward the monumental architecture that would come to define this civilization, and they suggest that the social organization necessary to coordinate such construction projects was already taking shape. The ceremonies that took place on these platforms are lost to us now, their details unrecoverable from the archaeological record, but we can imagine gatherings of community members, perhaps the performance of rituals marking the turning of the seasons or the transitions of human life. Moments when the bonds of community were affirmed and strengthened through shared experience. The period from roughly 2000 BCE to 250 CE is known to archaeologists as the pre-classic or formative period of Maya history, and it is during this long span of time that the foundations of Maya civilization were laid. Village life became increasingly complex during these centuries, with settlements growing in size and developing more elaborate social hierarchies. As certain individuals and families accumulated more wealth and influence than others, and as the roles of chiefs and priests began to crystallize, trade networks expanded, connecting communities across great distances and allowing the exchange not only of goods but of ideas and practices. And specialized crafts emerged, as some individuals devoted themselves to pottery making or tool production or the creation of ritual objects, while relying on others for their food and other necessities. The archaeology of this period reveals a world in motion, a world of gradual but unmistakable change, as the scattered villages of the early centuries slowly coalesced into something larger and more structured. One of the most remarkable sites of the late pre-classic period is Nakbay, located in the heart of the Petén jungle in what is now northern Guatemala, where excavations have revealed a scale of construction that challenges our assumptions about the capabilities of these early Maya communities. By approximately 600 BCE, the people of Nakbay had built pyramids reaching 18 meters in height, massive structures of limestone and rubble that would have required the coordinated labor of hundreds or even thousands of workers, and that would have dominated the landscape for great distances around. These pyramids at Nakbay predate most of the famous Maya cities that visitors admire today, preceding the great monuments of Tikal and Palenque and Copán by many centuries. And they remind us that the Maya achievement did not spring suddenly into being, but developed through a long process of experimentation and accumulation. The people who built Nakbay were not primitive villagers on the threshold of civilization, but were already participants in a sophisticated culture with complex social organization, advanced architectural knowledge, and a vision of the world that found expression in stone. Alongside the development of architecture and social complexity, the pre-classic Maya elaborated a rich symbolic and material culture in which certain substances came to hold special significance. Among the most important of these was jade, the hard green stone that the Maya prized above all others, valuing it more highly even than gold, which held such fascination for the European conquerors who would arrive many centuries later. The primary source of Maya jade was the Motagua Valley in eastern Guatemala, where outcrops of the precious stone occurred naturally, and where quarrying and working of jade became a specialized industry. And from this valley, jade was traded throughout the Maya world and beyond, reaching communities hundreds of kilometers distant and serving as a marker of status and sacredness wherever it went. Jade was associated with water and with maize, with breath and life, and the verdant growth of the natural world, and it adorned the bodies of rulers and accompanied the dead into their graves, a substance that bridged the ordinary world and the realm of the sacred. The trade in jade and other precious materials helped to knit together the far-flung communities of the Maya region, creating networks of exchange and obligation that would provide the infrastructure for the political and economic developments of later centuries. As the pre-classic period drew toward its close in the early centuries of the Common Era, the Maya world stood on the threshold of what archaeologists call the Classic Period, an era of unprecedented florescence, when the great cities would rise and the monuments would multiply, and the achievements of Maya civilization would reach their height. But the seeds of that florescence had been planted long before, in the quiet villages of Cuelo, and the ceremonial platforms of Ceiba, and the towering pyramids of Nakbe, in the fields of maize and beans and squash that sustained generation after generation, and in the trade routes that carried jade from the Motagua Valley to communities across the region. The Maya civilization that would astonish the world with its art and its architecture and its astronomical learning did not emerge from nothing, but grew from roots that reached deep into the soil of the pre-classic centuries, drawing nourishment from the accumulated knowledge and experience of countless individuals whose names are now forgotten, but whose efforts made possible all that would follow. And so we may picture those early Maya farmers and builders and traders going about their daily lives, rising with the sun to tend their fields, gathering to mark the passage of the seasons with ceremony and celebration, teaching their children the skills and stories they had learned from their own parents, and slowly, gradually, without any awareness that they were participants in a great historical process, laying the groundwork for a civilization that would endure for more than 2,000 years. There is something peaceful in this image, something reassuring in the thought of these ordinary human beings doing the ordinary work of living, and, in doing so, creating something extraordinary. And as we consider their story, we may feel ourselves connected to them across the vast distance of time, fellow travelers on the long human journey, sharing in the same fundamental experiences of work and rest, of community and solitude, of hope and uncertainty, that have always defined what it means to be human, deep within the lowland rainforest of northern Guatemala, in a region known as the Petén. There rises from the jungle canopy a series of pale limestone temples that have stood for more than 1,000 years, their roof combs piercing through the treetops like the fins of ancient stone creatures swimming through an endless green sea. This is Tikal, and for centuries it was among the most powerful and influential cities in the entire Maya world, a true superpower of the classical period, whose rulers commanded armies, built monuments of staggering ambition, and engaged in political intrigues that spanned generations. The story of Tikal is one that unfolds very slowly, over the course of nearly 2 millennia of human habitation, and so we shall tell it in the same unhurried manner, allowing the details to settle gently, like the morning mist that still drifts through these ruins at dawn. The settlement of Tikal began perhaps as early as 900 BCE, when small groups of people first established themselves in this particular stretch of jungle, drawn perhaps by the elevated terrain and the availability of flint for tool-making. For many centuries, it remained a modest community, growing gradually in size and complexity as the Maya developed their sophisticated understanding of agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. By the late pre-classic period, roughly 400 BCE to 100 CE, Tikal had begun to emerge as a significant center, constructing the first of its great pyramids and establishing the royal dynasties that would rule for generations to come. The city's name in ancient times was likely Mutal, or possibly Yaxmutal, meaning first Mutal, and the emblem glyph associated with its rulers depicted a distinctive knotted bundle of hair that appears again and again in the carved monuments scattered throughout the site. The location of Tikal, while inland and far from the coasts, offered certain advantages that helped it rise to prominence among the competing Maya city-states. The surrounding jungle, though dense and challenging, was rich in resources, and the slightly elevated position of the site meant that the ground was somewhat better drained than the swampier lowlands nearby. The people of Tikal developed sophisticated systems for capturing and storing rainwater, creating reservoirs that could sustain the population through the dry season. and they cultivated the forest itself in ways that modern archaeologists are only beginning to fully understand. The causeways known as Sacbeorb, a term meaning white roads in the Yucatec Maya language, connected the various temple complexes and residential areas of the city, their surfaces covered with a smooth white plaster made from burned limestone that would have gleamed brilliantly under the tropical sun. These roads were not merely practical thoroughfares, but also served ceremonial and symbolic purposes, linking sacred spaces in a careful geometry that reflected Maya understanding of cosmic order. For a long time, scholars believed that Tikal's rise to dominance was a gradual and largely indigenous process, the natural result of wise rulers and favorable circumstances accumulating over centuries. But the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing in the latter half of the 20th century revealed a far more dramatic turning point in the city's history, an event that occurred on a very specific date that we can now identify with remarkable precision. On January 16, 378 CE, by our modern calendar, a figure called Siaj Kaka arrived at Tikal, and nothing would ever be quite the same. His name translates as "fire is born," and the inscriptions tell us that he came from the west, almost certainly connected in some way to the great metropolis of Teotihuacan, located far away in the central highlands of Mexico near present-day Mexico City. This event is sometimes called the entrada, or the arrival, and its significance has transformed our understanding of ancient Mesoamerican politics. The inscriptions are careful to note that on the very same day that Siaj Kakach arrived at Tikal, the existing king, a ruler named Chak Tokik Shak, entered the water, which is the Maya metaphorical expression for death. Whether this death was a direct result of military conquest, a palace coup facilitated by the newcomer, or some other form of political transformation, remains a matter of scholarly discussion, but the coincidence of dates strongly suggests that the arrival and the death were intimately connected. Following this upheaval, a new dynasty was established at Tikal, with close ties to the distant power of Teotihuacan, and the artistic and architectural styles of the city began to show unmistakable influences from that far-off highland culture. The relationship between Tikal and Teotihuacan remains one of the most intriguing puzzles in Maya archaeology. For Teotihuacan was not a Maya city at all, but rather a massive urban center of a different cultural tradition, located some 1,000 kilometers to the northwest. How its influence came to reshape the politics of the Maya lowlands, and whether Siaj Kach was himself a Teotihuacano lord or a Maya ruler who had adopted foreign symbols of power, are questions that continue to generate thoughtful debate among researchers. In the centuries following the Entrada, Tikal grew into what might reasonably be called an empire, though the political arrangements of the ancient Maya were far more fluid and complex than that simple term suggests. The city's rulers extended their influence over neighboring settlements, formed alliances through marriage and diplomacy, and engaged in the ritual warfare that was so central to Maya political life. But Tikal was not without rivals, and by far the most significant of these was the city of Calakmul, located some 100 kilometers to the north in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul became the defining geopolitical conflict of the Maya Classic period, a struggle for dominance that shaped events throughout the lowlands for at least 2 centuries. Scholars have sometimes referred to this prolonged conflict as the Maya Star Wars, not in reference to the popular film franchise, but because the Maya recorded certain types of military events with a distinctive glyph showing a star-like symbol pouring water or falling toward the earth, which seems to indicate a particular kind of attack or cosmic event associated with warfare. The fortunes of this great rivalry shifted back and forth over the generations, as first one city and then the other gained the upper hand. In 562 CE, Calakmul and its allies dealt Tikal a devastating defeat, initiating what scholars call the Tikal hiatus, a period of more than a century, during which the city erected very few carved monuments and seemed to suffer a significant decline in power and prestige. The details of this defeat are not entirely clear from the surviving inscriptions, but it appears that Tikal's king was either killed or captured, and the city fell under the influence of its enemies. For several generations, Tikal remained in this diminished state, its voice largely silent in the epigraphic record, while Calakmul and its allies dominated the political landscape of the Maya lowlands. But the story of Tikal did not end with this defeat, and the city's eventual resurgence would produce some of its most impressive monuments. The revival began in earnest under a ruler named Josor Chankayawil I, who ascended to the throne in 682 CE and set about restoring Tikal to its former glory. In 695 CE, Josor Chankayawil achieved a great military victory over Calakmul itself, capturing that city's king in battle and effectively breaking the power of Tikal's longtime rival. This triumph marked the beginning of a new golden age for Tikal, during which the city's population may have reached its maximum extent, with estimates suggesting that between 60,000 and 100,000 people lived within the greater Tikal area, including the urban core and the surrounding settlements that fell under its direct influence. It was during this period of renewed prosperity that Tikal's most iconic monuments were constructed, and none is more famous than the structure known today as Temple 1, or the Temple of the Great Jaguar. This magnificent pyramid rises 47 meters above the Great Plaza, its steep limestone walls ascending in 9 terraces to a small temple structure at the summit, crowned by a towering roof comb that once bore elaborate sculptural decoration. The temple was built around 732 CE as a funerary monument for Josor Chankayawil I himself, who had died around 734 CE, and his tomb lies deep within the pyramid's core, accompanied by a rich collection of jade ornaments, ceramic vessels, and carved bones that testify to his status and accomplishments. The temple faces west across the Great Plaza toward its twin, Temple 2, which was likely dedicated to Josor Chankayawil's queen, and together these two structures frame a vast ceremonial space that formed the heart of the city. The construction of these great temples required an enormous investment of labor and resources, and the logistics of such projects tell us much about the organizational capabilities of Maya society. The limestone blocks had to be quarried, shaped, and transported to the construction site, then lifted into place and covered with smooth plaster and brightly painted decorations that have long since faded away. The workers who carried out this labor were likely not slaves, but rather tribute workers and devoted subjects who participated in what was understood as a sacred enterprise, the creation of a dwelling place for divine kings and a focus for the rituals that maintained cosmic order. At its peak, Tikal must have been a place of considerable activity and noise, filled with the sounds of construction, commerce, and ceremony, though the temples themselves were likely restricted spaces where only priests and royalty could enter. The decline of Tikal, like that of so many other Maya cities, came gradually during the 9th century CE, part of the broader phenomenon sometimes called the Maya collapse, that saw the abandonment of major centers throughout the southern lowlands. The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in 869 CE, and within a few generations, the great plazas and temple complexes were falling into disrepair, the population dwindling as people migrated to other regions or dispersed into smaller settlements. The jungle, patient and persistent, began its slow reclamation of the stone structures, sending roots into the cracks between blocks and gradually blanketing the pyramids in dense vegetation until they appeared as nothing more than unusually steep hills rising from the forest floor. For nearly 1,000 years, Tikal lay largely forgotten by the outside world, though local Maya people may have retained some knowledge of the ruins and their significance. The modern rediscovery of the site came in 1848, when a Guatemalan government expedition led by the governor, Modesto Mendez, accompanied by a local guide named Ambrosio Tut, penetrated deep into the Petén jungle and came upon the ruins. Ambrosio Tut, whose contribution is sometimes overlooked in historical accounts, was essential to this discovery, possessing the knowledge of local terrain and forest navigation that made the expedition possible. The report published by Mendez brought Tikal to the attention of scholars and eventually led to systematic archaeological investigation that continues to this day. Modern visitors to Tikal often find that the ruins are not entirely uninhabited. The howler monkeys that now make their home in the forests surrounding the temples are among the most vocal residents, their deep, resonant calls echoing through the trees in the early morning hours, and occasionally startling those who have come to observe the ruins in peaceful contemplation. These monkeys were sacred to the ancient Maya, associated with the arts and with the scribes who created the beautiful books and inscriptions that recorded Maya history and thought. Their presence today provides a living connection to the ancient past, a reminder that the jungle environment which shaped Maya civilization continues to enfold these monuments in its green embrace. The temples of Tikal still rise above the canopy, visible from great distances when viewed from the summits, offering panoramic views of unbroken forest stretching to the horizon in every direction. The silence that settles over the ruins at dusk, broken only by the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves, invites reflection on the long centuries that have passed since priests and kings walked these causeways. The limestone, warm from the afternoon sun, releases its heat slowly into the cooling air, and the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above. Tikal sleeps now, as it has slept for more than a millennium, its secrets slowly yielding to patient scholarship, and its monuments standing in quiet testimony to the remarkable civilization that built them. In the tropical lowlands of what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, nestled against the first rising slopes of the highland mountains, there lies a city that seems almost to have grown from the jungle itself, its pale limestone structures emerging from the deep green forest like something remembered from a pleasant dream. This is Palenque, and though it was never the largest of the Maya cities, it has come to be regarded by many scholars as perhaps the most elegant, the most refined in its artistic sensibilities, and in many ways the most intimate of all the great ancient centers. The ruins that remain today represent only a fraction of what once stood here, for the jungle has reclaimed much of what the Maya built over the centuries, and archaeological surveys suggest that hundreds of structures still sleep beneath the forest canopy, their outlines softened by centuries of accumulated soil and the patient embrace of roots and vines. What has been uncovered, however, is quite remarkable enough to occupy our thoughts for this quiet time together, as we consider the kings who ruled here, the artists who adorned these buildings with some of the finest sculpture in the ancient Americas, and the discoveries that have revealed something of the lives and deaths of those who called this place their home. The city's classic period name was Lacamha, which translates to something like big water, a reference perhaps to the numerous streams and springs that flow through and around the site, giving it a quality of constant gentle movement, the sound of water always present somewhere nearby. The modern name Palenque comes from the Spanish and refers to a wooden stockade or palisade, though this was applied much later and has little to do with the ancient city itself. What made Palenque distinctive among Maya cities was not its size or military power, for it was relatively modest in both respects, but rather the extraordinary refinement of its architecture and the quality of its sculptural tradition, which reached heights of naturalism and emotional expressiveness that remain unmatched in the Maya world. The buildings here tend toward lighter, more open designs than those found at sites like Tikal or Calakmul, with thinner walls made possible by engineering innovations and larger interior spaces that must have created a different quality of light and air within. The roof cones, those tall decorative structures that crowned Maya temples, were here designed as hollow lattices rather than solid masses, reducing the weight that the walls below needed to support and allowing for taller, more graceful proportions. Among all the rulers of Palenque, one name emerges with particular clarity from the inscriptions and the archaeological record, and that is King Pakal, known to scholars today simply as Pakal, or sometimes Pakal the Great, though such honorific additions are of course modern interpretations rather than ancient titles. The name Kenich refers to the sun god and was a common element in royal names. While Pakal means shield in the Mayan language, he came to the throne of Palenque in the year 615 of the Common Era, when he was just 12 years old, a child taking up the burdens of rulership in what must have been a time of considerable uncertainty for the city. The previous decades had seen Palenque suffer military defeats at the hands of its rivals, particularly the powerful kingdom of Calakmul and its ally Tonina, and the young king inherited a realm that had experienced trauma and perhaps a degree of diminished prestige among its neighbors. His mother, Lady Sak Cook, appears to have served as regent during his early years on the throne, and inscriptions suggest she played a significant role in legitimizing his rule during a period when the normal lines of succession may have been disrupted. What followed was one of the longest reigns in Maya history, stretching across 68 years until Pakal's death in 683 of the Common Era, by which time he had transformed Palenque from a recovering city-state into one of the most culturally significant centers of the Maya world. The building program he initiated was extensive, and many of the structures that visitors see today were begun or completed during his reign or that of his immediate successors. It was Pakal who commissioned the Temple of the Inscriptions, that stepped pyramid that rises at the edge of the ceremonial center, its 9 levels representing perhaps the 9 levels of Xibalba, the Maya underworld. The temple at its summit contains 3 large panels, bearing one of the longest Maya hieroglyphic texts known, some 600 individual glyph blocks that record the history of Palenque's dynasty, the deeds of its rulers, and the mythological framework within which they understood their place in the cosmos. These inscriptions gave the building its modern name, though its ancient designation remains a matter of scholarly discussion. For many years, the Temple of the Inscriptions was appreciated simply as an impressive architectural achievement and a valuable source of hieroglyphic texts, and no one suspected that it held a far more remarkable secret within its massive stone body. That changed in 1948, when a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruiz-Willier noticed something curious in the floor of the temple at the pyramid's summit. One of the large stone slabs that formed the floor had a double row of holes fitted with removable stone plugs, suggesting that it had been designed to be lifted, though for what purpose was entirely unclear. Since Maya temple pyramids were not then known to contain internal burial chambers in the manner of Egyptian pyramids, Ruiz obtained permission to investigate, and when the slab was raised, it revealed a passage filled completely with rubble, the stones carefully packed in place as though to seal something away and protect it from disturbance. What followed was 4 years of painstaking excavation, as Roos and his team slowly removed the fill from the internal stairway, bucket by bucket, season by season, working their way down through the body of the pyramid. The stairway descended at a steep angle, turned back upon itself, and continued deeper into the structure. And as the workers cleared each section, they found that the Maya builders had taken extraordinary care to seal the passage completely, leaving no gaps or voids that might allow easy access to whatever lay below. In 1952, after removing approximately 300 cubic meters of rubble, the excavators reached a chamber containing a stone box with the remains of several individuals, apparently sacrificial offerings, and beyond this, a triangular stone door still sealed in its original position. When this door was finally moved aside on the 15th of June, 1952, Roos Willier became the first person in over 1,200 years to enter the burial chamber of Pakal the Great. The chamber itself is carved from the living rock of the hillside upon which the pyramid was built. A vaulted space measuring about 7 meters long and nearly 4 meters wide. Its walls decorated with stucco figures of individuals emerging from the earth, perhaps representing ancestors or deities associated with the underworld. But the dominant feature of the room, the object that immediately drew the eye and has captivated scholars and visitors ever since, was the massive stone sarcophagus that occupied most of the floor space. The sarcophagus itself weighs several tons and is carved from a single block of limestone. But it is the lid that has become one of the most famous objects in all of Maya archaeology. This carved slab, measuring some 3.5 meters long and over 2 meters wide, depicts Pakal at the moment of his death, falling or descending into the open jaws of the earth, represented as a skeletal creature that symbolizes the passage into Xibalba. The king is shown in an intermediate position, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, surrounded by symbols of celestial and terrestrial significance. The whole composition, a complex statement about death, rebirth, and the cosmic role of Maya royalty. A great tree rises from behind his falling figure, connecting the underworld below to the heavens above, its branches reaching toward the celestial realm, where he will eventually be reborn as a divine being. Within the sarcophagus, Roos found the skeleton of a man adorned with jade ornaments of extraordinary quality, including a mosaic mask that had been placed over his face, ear spools, rings, and a large jade bead that had been placed in his mouth, perhaps to serve as sustenance for his journey through the underworld. The skeletal remains have been studied extensively in the decades since their discovery, and they present something of a puzzle. For while the inscriptions clearly state that Pakal was 80 years old at the time of his death, having ruled for 68 years after ascending the throne at age 12, some physical anthropologists initially believed the bones appeared to be those of a man in his 40s or 50s rather than an octogenarian. This discrepancy has generated considerable discussion, though more recent analyses have suggested that the apparent youthfulness of the skeleton may reflect the excellent health and nutrition enjoyed by Maya royalty, combined with the inherent difficulties of age estimation from skeletal remains alone. Whatever his precise age, there is no doubt that Pakal enjoyed an unusually long life by the standards of his time, and that his reign left an indelible mark upon his city. Palenque's capacity for remarkable tomb discoveries was demonstrated again more than 4 decades later, when in 1994, archaeologists working in Temple of Inscriptions, a small pyramid located immediately adjacent to the Temple of the Inscriptions, discovered another undisturbed burial chamber. This tomb was smaller than Pakal's, but no less striking in its contents. For within lay the skeleton of a woman whose remains had been entirely covered with cinnabar, a bright red mercury sulfide mineral that gave her bones and the interior of her sarcophagus a vivid crimson color. The application of cinnabar to elite burials was not uncommon in Maya practice, as the red color was associated with blood, life force, and the east where the sun rises, but the sheer quantity used in this burial was exceptional. The woman has become known as the Red Queen, and while no inscriptions were found within the tomb to identify her directly, most scholars believe she was Lady Sakbu Ajur, the principal wife of Pakal the Great, based on the proximity of her burial to his and the rich quality of her grave goods. She too was adorned with a mosaic jade mask, though hers was made with smaller pieces than her husband's, and her tomb contained shell ornaments, jade jewelry, and bone needles that may have been used in bloodletting rituals during her lifetime. Beyond the temple pyramids that have yielded these extraordinary burials, Palenque contains numerous other structures of interest, among which the palace is perhaps the most complex and unusual. This large building group sits on an artificial platform and comprises multiple structures arranged around interior courtyards, connected by galleries and corridors that create a labyrinthine quality, quite different from the more straightforward temple complexes found elsewhere in the Maya world. The most distinctive feature of the palace is a four-story tower that rises from its southwestern section, the only structure of its kind known from the ancient Maya region. The tower's interior contains a square staircase that winds up through each level, and windows on each floor would have provided views across the surrounding landscape and the ceremonial center below. Some researchers have proposed that this tower served an astronomical function, perhaps allowing priests or astronomers to observe celestial events above the tree canopy, particularly the winter solstice sun, which, when viewed from certain points within the palace, sets directly behind the Temple of the Inscriptions on that significant date, appearing to descend into Pakal's tomb. The palace also preserves some of the finest examples of Maya stucco sculpture, a medium in which Palenque's artists excelled. Unlike stone carving, which requires removal of material to create form, stucco work is essentially additive, building up layers of lime plaster to create three-dimensional figures that were then painted in vivid colors. The heads and figures that survive at Palenque display a naturalism and sensitivity that suggest these were portraits of actual individuals rather than idealized types, their faces showing subtle variations in feature and expression that bring them startlingly close to life even after more than a millennium. Another treasure of Palenque's sculptural heritage is the tablet of the 96 glyphs, a large stone panel that once adorned the palace and contains a beautifully carved text of 96 hieroglyphic blocks. The glyphs executed with a precision and elegance that makes this one of the finest examples of Maya writing as artistic expression. Palenque's builders also demonstrated considerable skill in managing the abundant water that flows through the site, constructing an aqueduct that channels the Otulam River directly beneath the palace platform through a vaulted stone conduit. This engineering work served multiple purposes, controlling the flow of water to prevent flooding of the ceremonial center, while also providing access to fresh water for the palace inhabitants, and perhaps creating the pleasant sound of running water within the royal residence. The system demonstrates that Maya engineers were capable of large-scale hydraulic projects and understood how to work with the natural features of their environment rather than simply imposing their will upon the landscape. As you rest now, you might allow your thoughts to settle upon Palenque like evening mist gathering in a jungle valley, imagining the pale stone catching the last light of day, the sound of water moving somewhere out of sight, and the green forest pressing close on every side. The kings who ruled here have been gone for more than 1,000 years, And the artists who created such beauty left no names that we can read. Yet something of their presence remains in the stones they shaped and the spaces they defined. Pakal sleeps still beneath his pyramid, the great carved lid depicting his endless fall into the underworld, and nearby his queen rests in her crimson chamber, both of them surrounded by the quiet jungle and the slow passage of time. These are gentle mysteries, the kind that need not be solved tonight or any night, but simply held in the mind like smooth stones. Their weight and coolness, a comfort as sleep approaches. For many centuries, the elaborate carvings that adorned Maya temples and monuments remained entirely mysterious to those who gazed upon them, and the intricate symbols painted in folded books of bark paper seemed to belong to a world of knowledge forever sealed away from modern understanding. The Spanish conquest had brought with it a systematic destruction of Maya learning, and the priests and scholars who once read these texts with ease had passed from living memory long before anyone thought to ask them what the symbols meant. And so the glyphs became objects of speculation rather than sources of information, admired for their beauty, but assumed by many European observers to be purely decorative, or perhaps mystical diagrams that could never be translated into ordinary language. The story of how this assumption was gradually overturned, and how the Maya script eventually yielded its secrets to patient researchers across several continents, is a gentle and meandering tale that unfolds across more than 400 years. And it is a story worth knowing as you settle in for the evening. We might begin in the year 1566, on the Yucatan Peninsula, where a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa was compiling his observations about the Maya people, among whom he had lived and worked for some years. De Landa was a complicated figure in history, responsible both for destroying countless Maya books in his zealous efforts to eliminate what he considered pagan practices, and paradoxically, for preserving more information about Maya culture than any other Spanish colonist of his era. His manuscript, which would come to be known as the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, or an account of the things of Yucatan, contained detailed descriptions of Maya customs, calendar systems, religious practices, and crucially, an attempt to record the Maya writing system. De Landa had asked his Maya informants to write down the equivalent of each letter of the Spanish alphabet, and they had obliged him as best they could, producing what appeared to be a straightforward key to the script. This seemed like a tremendous gift to future scholars, a simple alphabet that would allow anyone to read Maya texts once the document was rediscovered and published centuries later. And yet, as researchers would eventually come to understand, the task De Landa had set was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how Maya writing actually worked, and his so-called alphabet was not quite what it appeared to be. The difficulty was this: when De Landa asked a Maya scribe to write the letter B, for instance, the scribe heard the sound of the Spanish letter being pronounced, which sounded something like the syllable bay, and so the scribe wrote a symbol that represented that sound in Maya. The same process occurred for each letter, with the scribes faithfully recording syllables rather than individual consonants or vowels. The result was not an alphabet at all, but rather a collection of syllabic signs, each representing a consonant-vowel combination, all jumbled together with a few logographic signs that represented entire words. For the next 3 centuries, scholars who attempted to use De Landa's alphabet found themselves unable to make any sense of Maya inscriptions, and many concluded that either De Landa had been deceived or that Maya writing was simply not phonetic in nature. Some proposed that the glyphs were purely ideographic, each symbol representing an idea or concept rather than a sound, much as some Europeans imagined Chinese characters to function. Others suggested that the inscriptions were merely decorative patterns arranged to please the eye rather than to communicate specific information. These theories persisted for a remarkably long time, and they were encouraged by the fact that so few Maya texts had survived for study. Of the thousands of screenfold books that once existed, filled with accumulated Maya knowledge about astronomy, history, ritual, and medicine, only 3 codices are known to have survived the colonial period intact. And each of these precious documents eventually found its way to a European library, where it was named after the city in which it came to rest. The Dresden Codex, which is generally considered the finest and most complete of the 3, contains detailed astronomical tables and calculations that allowed scholars to recognize the sophistication of Maya mathematical thought, even when they could not read the accompanying text. The Madrid Codex, longer but less carefully executed, appears to deal primarily with divination and the activities of various deities. The Paris Codex, fragmentary and damaged, preserves portions of what seems to be a ceremonial calendar and a zodiacal sequence. These 3 books, along with the thousands of carved inscriptions on stone monuments, ceramic vessels, and architectural elements, constituted the entire surviving corpus of Maya writing, and for generations they resisted all attempts at interpretation. The breakthrough that would eventually unlock Maya script came from an unexpected quarter, in a city far removed from the tropical forests where the inscriptions had been carved. In 1952, a young Russian epigrapher named Yuri Valentinovich Norosov published a paper in the Soviet journal Sovetskaya Ethnografia that proposed a radically new approach to Maya decipherment. Norosov had become interested in the problem while studying at Moscow State University during the Second World War, and he had obtained a copy of the published reproductions of the Maya codices, which he studied with great care during and after the war years, working in almost complete isolation from Western scholars, as the Cold War had erected formidable barriers to academic communication between the Soviet Union and the Americas. Norosov applied the principles of structural linguistics to the Maya glyphs, and he returned to De Landa's maligned alphabet with fresh eyes. He recognized that De Landa's informants had not been confused or deceptive, but had instead been faithfully recording syllables, just as one would expect from a writing system that was logosyllabic in nature, combining signs for whole words with signs for individual syllables. Using this insight, Norosov was able to demonstrate that certain Maya glyphs represented syllables that could be combined to spell out words phonetically, and he successfully read several glyphs that appeared in the codices alongside illustrations, identifying words for turkey, dog, and various other concepts. The Western academic establishment was slow to accept Norosov's work, in part because of the political tensions of the era, and in part because his conclusions contradicted the prevailing orthodoxy championed by J. Eric S. Thompson, the most influential Mayanist of the mid-20th century. Thompson believed firmly that Maya writing was primarily ideographic, and that the inscriptions dealt almost exclusively with astronomy, calendar calculations, and the doings of gods rather than human beings. He dismissed Norosov's phonetic readings as Soviet propaganda dressed up as scholarship, and his immense prestige delayed the acceptance of the syllabic approach for nearly 2 decades. And yet, the evidence in favor of Norosov's method continued to accumulate, and other researchers began to make discoveries that supported and extended his insights. In 1960, an American archaeologist named Tatiana Proskouriakoff published a paper that transformed understanding of what the Maya inscriptions actually recorded. Working with the carved monuments from the site of Piedras Negras in Guatemala, Proskouriakoff noticed patterns in the dates and images that suggested a very different interpretation from the purely astronomical readings that had been assumed. She observed that the dates on the monuments at any given site spanned reasonable human lifespans, and that certain recurring glyphs seemed to mark events such as accessions to rulership, births, and important rituals. The inscriptions, she proposed, were not abstract astronomical treatises, but rather historical records documenting the lives and achievements of individual rulers. This was a revelation that fundamentally changed the field, for it meant that the Maya had left behind detailed accounts of real people and real events, accounts that could be read once the glyphs were properly understood. The silent cities in the jungle began to yield the names and deeds of kings and queens who had ruled them 1,000 years before. Around the same time, a German-Mexican epigrapher named Heinrich Berlin identified a category of glyphs that he called emblem glyphs, distinctive symbols that appeared to be associated with specific Maya cities. Each major site seemed to have its own emblem glyph, which appeared in the titles of its rulers and in texts recording interactions between cities. This discovery revealed that the Maya had a strong sense of political geography, that they recognized and named their individual kingdoms, and that the inscriptions often recorded the complex relationships between these polities, including alliances, marriages, wars, and conquests. The formerly nameless ruins began to acquire identities, and researchers could start to reconstruct the political history of the Maya world in some detail. The pace of decipherment accelerated dramatically in the early 1970s, and a pivotal moment came at a conference held in the Mexican town of Palenque in December of 1973. This gathering, known as the Primera Mesa Redonda de Palenque, or the First Palenque Roundtable, brought together a small group of dedicated researchers who spent several days working intensively on the inscriptions from that extraordinarily well-preserved site. Among those present was Linda Shale, an artist who had become passionately interested in Maya epigraphy after visiting Palenque, and Peter Matthews, a young Australian scholar who would go on to make major contributions to the field. Working together with other participants, Shale and Matthews managed to read the dynastic history of Palenque's rulers directly from the inscriptions on the Temple of the Inscriptions and other monuments, recovering the names and relationships of kings who had been forgotten for a millennium. The collaborative atmosphere of the Mesa Redonda became a model for future research, and the event is often cited as the moment when Maya decipherment truly came of age. One of the most remarkable contributors to the field was David Stewart, who began making significant discoveries when he was barely a teenager. Stewart had grown up in the world of Maya archaeology, as his father was also a scholar of the ancient Maya, and his precocious abilities became evident at an extraordinarily young age. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already contributing to the decipherment of previously unread glyphs, and his insights would continue to shape the field for decades to come. Stewart's work demonstrated that even established signs often had readings that had been overlooked, and his careful analysis of the ways that glyphs were combined and substituted for one another helped to establish the full complexity of the Maya writing system. That system, as we now understand it, is what linguists call logosyllabic, meaning that it combines two different types of signs in a flexible and expressive manner. Some glyphs are lograms, representing entire words or concepts with a single sign, much as the numeral 5 represents the concept of that quantity in modern writing without spelling out the sounds. Other glyphs are syllabograms, representing syllables consisting of a consonant and a vowel, or occasionally just a vowel alone. Writers could spell the same word in multiple ways, using a logram by itself, a combination of syllabic signs that spelled out the word phonetically, or a logogram accompanied by syllabic signs that clarified its pronunciation. This flexibility allowed for considerable artistic variation, and scribes took evident pleasure in creating aesthetically pleasing arrangements of signs, sometimes substituting rare or elaborate forms for common ones to demonstrate their learning and skill. The total inventory of known Maya glyphs numbers approximately 800 distinct signs, though not all of these have been securely deciphered, and researchers continue to refine and extend our understanding of the system. In recent years, the tools available for studying Maya inscriptions have expanded to include computational approaches, and in 2023, several research groups announced the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to assist in the decipherment of previously unread texts. These methods can identify patterns across large numbers of inscriptions more quickly than any human researcher, and they can suggest possible readings based on statistical analysis of known sign values and textual contexts. While AI remains a tool to assist human scholars rather than a replacement for their expertise, these developments suggest that the pace of discovery may continue to accelerate, and that texts which have resisted interpretation for decades may yet yield their secrets. And so the long struggle to decode Maya writing, which began with De Lander's well-intentioned but flawed alphabet in the 16th century, has arrived at something approaching completion, though much work remains to be done. We can now read the names of Maya kings and queens, the dates of their births and accessions and deaths, the records of their wars and rituals and building projects, and some portion of the myths and astronomical knowledge preserved in the surviving codices. The cities in the jungle are no longer silent, and the voices of their builders can be heard again after 1,000 years of quiet. In the southeastern reaches of the Maya realm, nestled within a fertile valley in what is now western Honduras, there lies a place that scholars have long regarded as one of the most refined and intellectually vibrant centers of the ancient world, a city whose sculptors and astronomers achieved such heights of accomplishment that it has often been called the Athens of the Maya world. And this place is Copán, where the gentle Copán River winds through emerald hills, and where, for more than 4 centuries, a succession of rulers transformed a modest settlement into a flourishing capital of art and science. A place where stone was carved with such extraordinary skill that the figures seem almost to breathe, and where learned men gathered to contemplate the movements of the heavens and to refine the calendrical calculations that govern the rhythm of Maya life. The valley of Copán sits at an elevation of roughly 600 meters, surrounded by pine-forested mountains that catch the afternoon clouds and release them as gentle mists that drift down into the lowlands below. And the river that gives the city its modern name meanders through the valley floor, depositing rich alluvial soils that made this region particularly suited to agriculture, allowing the population to grow and supporting the specialized craftspeople and scholars who would make Copán famous throughout the Maya world. And the climate here is somewhat cooler and more temperate than the sweltering lowlands to the north, a factor that surely made the valley an attractive place to settle and to build. And it was into this pleasant landscape that a remarkable figure arrived in the early 5th century of the Common Era, a man whose coming would establish a dynasty that would endure for nearly 400 years. His name was Kenich Yax K. Kuk Mo, which translates roughly as Sun-eyed First Quetzal Macaw, and the inscriptions tell us that he arrived at Copán in the year 426 of the Common Era, though the precise circumstances of his coming remain somewhat mysterious, wrapped in the deliberate ambiguity that Maya rulers often employed when describing their origins. And the texts indicate that he came from the west, from a place the Maya called Huaytena, which may refer to the great central Mexican metropolis of Teotihuacan, or to some intermediate location along the way. And regardless of his ultimate origin, he brought with him symbols and artistic styles that suggest strong connections to the highland Mexican world, including a distinctive type of goggle-eyed war imagery associated with the Teotihuacan storm deity. And these foreign associations may have lent him an exotic prestige that helped establish his authority in this new land. The founder's arrival was commemorated for centuries afterward, with later kings tracing their legitimacy back through an unbroken line of succession to this original dynastic patriarch. And when archaeologists excavated deep beneath the later construction at Copán, they discovered the tombs of the earliest rulers, including what appears to be the burial of Kenich Yaxke Kirkmo himself, whose skeletal remains showed evidence of injuries consistent with a life of warfare, including a parrying fracture on his forearm that had healed long before his death. And chemical analysis of his bones revealed that he had spent his childhood somewhere other than Copán, lending support to the inscription's claims that he was indeed a foreigner who came to establish a new kingdom in this valley. And around his burial were found objects that spoke of his connections to distant places, including shells from the Pacific coast and artifacts in the style of Teotihuacan. For more than 1,000 years after the collapse of Maya civilization in this region, the ruins of Copán lay largely forgotten by the outside world, though the local inhabitants surely knew of the strange carved stones and crumbling pyramids that stood in the forest. And it was not until 1576 that a Spanish colonial official named Diego Garcia de Palacio became the first European to describe these remains in writing, when he dispatched a letter to King Philip II of Spain reporting on the marvelous ruins he had encountered during his travels through the province of Honduras. And in this letter, he described great plazas and pyramids, elaborate sculptured figures, and buildings of such sophistication that he marveled at who might have built them, for the indigenous people of his own time seemed to him incapable of such accomplishments, a prejudice common among the colonizers of that era. And his letter languished in the archives for centuries before scholars rediscovered it and recognized its importance as the first European documentation of Maya ruins, among the most remarkable monuments at Copán, and indeed in all the Maya world, is the structure known as the hieroglyphic stairway, a grand flight of 63 steps ascending the western face of a pyramid. And what makes this stairway unique is that every riser of every step is carved with hieroglyphic texts, creating the longest known Maya inscription, comprising some 2,200 individual glyphs that together tell the history of the Copán dynasty from its founding by Kenich Yaxke Mo, down through the centuries to the time of the stairway's dedication. And this monumental text was commissioned by the 13th ruler in the dynastic sequence, a king known as Kak Ut Wits K Will, whose name incorporates references to fire and to the sacred lightning deity KK Will. And he dedicated this monument in the middle of the 8th century, at a time when Copán's prestige had suffered a significant blow, and the stairway may have served in part to reassert the grandeur and legitimacy of the dynasty. The sheer scale of this inscription is difficult to fully appreciate without seeing it, for the carved glyphs march up the stairway in an unbroken procession, each one carefully rendered by skilled scribes working in stone, and interspersed among the text blocks are sculpted figures of seated rulers wearing elaborate headdresses and ceremonial regalia, positioned at intervals along the stairs as if the kings themselves were watching over their recorded history. And unfortunately, the stairway had partially collapsed before archaeologists could document its original arrangement, and many of the glyph blocks were scattered and had to be reassembled, a task made extraordinarily difficult by the sheer number of pieces involved. And as a result, some portions of the text remain out of sequence, though scholars have made considerable progress in reconstructing the narrative. Beneath the visible pyramids and plazas of Copán lie earlier structures, preserved when later rulers chose to bury them rather than demolish them entirely. And in 1989, archaeologists tunneling beneath one of the main pyramid platforms made an extraordinary discovery: a complete temple that had been carefully entombed and protected for more than a millennium. Its original painted surface is still intact. And this building is now known as the Rosalila Temple, named for the colors that still adorned its stuccoed facades, predominantly a deep red that the Maya achieved through the use of cinnabar and other mineral pigments. And the preservation of this structure is remarkable because Maya buildings were typically covered with brightly colored plaster and paint that almost never survives the centuries of rain and humidity. And yet here was a complete temple with its sculptural program still visible, its elaborate deity masks and its three-dimensional model facades still bearing their original pigmentation. The Rosalila Temple dates to approximately 571 of the Common Era and was commissioned by a ruler whose name incorporated the precious jade stone. And it was dedicated to the founder, Kinich Yaks K Kukmo, serving as a kind of ancestral shrine where later kings could commune with their dynastic patriarch. And the sculptural program that covers its facades includes images of the Quetzal bird and the macaw, both creatures whose brilliant plumage held deep symbolic significance for the Maya. And the temple rises through multiple levels, each decorated with elaborate stucco sculptures that project outward from the walls, creating a three-dimensional effect quite different from the flat relief carving found at many other Maya sites. And this preference for fully modeled sculpture would become one of the defining characteristics of the Copán artistic tradition. The sculptors of Copán developed a distinctive style that set their work apart from that produced elsewhere in the Maya world, favoring fully three-dimensional figures carved in the round rather than the flat relief panels, more common at sites like Palenque or Yaxchilan. And walking through the ruins today, one encounters these remarkable sculptures at every turn. Standing stelae depicting kings in elaborate ceremonial dress, their figures projecting boldly from the stone shafts, their costumes rendered in such detail that individual feathers and jade beads are clearly visible. And the faces of these rulers gaze out with an individuality that suggests portraiture rather than idealization, with distinctive features that allow scholars to identify specific kings across multiple monuments, and altars carved in the form of zoomorphic creatures, their surfaces covered with writhing serpents and mythological beings, demonstrate a sculptural virtuosity that remains impressive even after more than a millennium of weathering. One ruler in particular presided over a golden age of artistic production at Copán, a king known to scholars as 18 Rabbit, though his formal name in the Maya language was Uaxaclajun, Uacahuil, a name that can be understood as 18 are the images of Cahuil, referring to the 18 forms or manifestations of the lightning deity. And this king ruled for 43 years, from 695 to 738 of the Common Era. And during his long reign, he commissioned an extraordinary series of monuments that transformed the main plaza of Copán into an outdoor gallery of sculptural masterpieces, with 7 magnificent stelae depicting himself in various ceremonial guises, each one demonstrating the distinctive Copán style of high-relief carving. And he also oversaw the construction of an elaborate ball court, one of the finest in the Maya world, where the ritual ball game was played with all its cosmological significance. The ball court at Copán features a set of remarkable sculptural markers positioned along the playing alley, carved in the form of macaw heads, their beaks open and their eyes rendered with the same careful attention to detail that characterizes all Copán sculpture. And the macaw held particular importance at Copán, serving as one of the primary symbols of the dynasty, likely connected to the founder's name, which included the Quetzal and the macaw, and the brilliant red, yellow, and blue plumage of the scarlet macaw, native to the tropical forests of this region, made it a creature of extraordinary symbolic power, associated with the sun and with the celestial realm. And these macaw head markers transformed the ball court into a cosmic arena, where the movements of the rubber ball replicated the movements of celestial bodies across the sky. The scientific achievements of Copán extended beyond its artistic accomplishments, for this city was renowned throughout the Maya world as a center of astronomical learning, and the inscriptions record that in the year 763 of the Common Era, astronomers gathered at Copán for what scholars have termed an astronomical congress, a meeting where learned men from across the Maya realm came together to compare their observations and to refine the calculations that govern the Maya calendar. And the Maya had developed extraordinarily precise methods for tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, and the visible planets, particularly Venus, whose cycles they could predict with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for many centuries, and Copán appears to have been a leading center for such studies, its astronomers making careful observations and developing mathematical models of remarkable sophistication. The reign of 18 Rabbit came to an abrupt and unexpected end in the year 738, when this great patron of arts and sciences was captured by the ruler of a smaller neighboring city called Quirigua, which had long been subordinate to Copán, and the inscriptions record that 18 Rabbit was brought to Quirigua, where he was ritually beheaded, an event that sent shockwaves through the political landscape of the region and represented a humiliating reversal for Copán, transforming what had been a vassal state into an independent and even rival power. And the loss of this ruler, who had done so much to beautify his city and to advance its scholarly reputation, marked the beginning of a more troubled period in Copán's history, though the city would continue to flourish for several more generations before the broader collapse that affected the entire Maya lowlands. The kings who followed 18 Rabbit worked to restore Copán's prestige, and it was in this context that the hieroglyphic stairway was commissioned, as a monumental reassertion of dynastic legitimacy and historical continuity. And the city's sculptors continued to produce remarkable works, and its astronomers continued their observations. But a gradual decline had begun that would eventually lead to the abandonment of the city in the 9th century. And today, the ruins of Copán stand in their valley, surrounded by the tobacco fields and cattle pastures of modern Honduras, a place where visitors can wander among the stelae and the temples, contemplating the achievements of a civilization that created beauty and knowledge in the midst of the tropical forest. And the carved stones still bear their messages, patient and enduring, waiting for those who would learn to read them. And so we come now to a quieter chapter in this long and winding story, a time when the great cities of the southern lowlands began to fall silent, one by one, like candles guttering in a gentle breeze. This period, which scholars call the terminal classic collapse, unfolded gradually between roughly 800 and 1000 of the Common Era, and it remains one of the most discussed and carefully studied transitions in all of ancient American history. The word collapse itself may seem dramatic, and yet the reality, as we shall see, was something more subtle and more human. A slow unraveling of systems that had sustained millions of people for centuries. A transformation rather than a sudden ending, though the silence left behind in those abandoned plazas would last for a very long time indeed. To understand what happened during these 2 centuries, we must first appreciate what came before. The classic Maya world, at its height, around 750 of the Common Era, was a landscape of bustling cities connected by trade routes and political alliances, of vast populations supported by intensive agriculture, of kings who claimed divine authority and built monuments to proclaim their power across the generations. The southern lowlands, that great sweep of territory encompassing what is now northern Guatemala, Belize, and the Mexican states of Chiapas and Campeche, contained perhaps 10 million people or more, living in cities and towns and farming communities scattered through the forest. And then, within the span of a few generations, most of these cities were simply abandoned, their temples left to the slow embrace of the jungle, their populations dispersed to places unknown, their kings no longer carving dates on stone monuments because there were no longer kings, or perhaps no longer anyone to read what they had written. The question of why this happened has occupied scholars for over a century, and the answer, as is so often the case with complex historical phenomena, appears to involve not a single cause, but rather a convergence of pressures that together exceeded the capacity of Maya society to adapt. We might imagine it as a rope woven from many strands, each strand a different stress upon the system. And while any single strand might have been survived, the combination proved too much to bear. Let us examine these strands one by one, beginning with perhaps the most fundamental of all, which is the matter of rainfall and the water that made life possible in this tropical landscape. The evidence for prolonged drought during the terminal Classic period has grown remarkably strong in recent decades, thanks to the patient work of scientists who have learned to read the chemical signatures of ancient climate preserved in unlikely places. Douglas Kennett, a researcher who has devoted much of his career to understanding the relationship between climate and Maya civilization, has contributed significantly to this body of knowledge through the analysis of stalagmites, those slow-growing mineral formations found in caves throughout the Maya region. As water drips through limestone and deposits calcium carbonate over centuries and millennia, the precise chemical composition of each layer records information about the rainfall that fell above, creating a kind of underground archive that scientists can read with remarkable precision. These stalagmite records, combined with the analysis of lake sediment cores taken from bodies of water throughout the region, tell a story of increasingly erratic and diminished rainfall during the 9th century of the Common Era. A particularly important study published in 2012 examines sediment cores from the Cariaco Basin off the coast of Venezuela, where variations in titanium content serve as a proxy for changes in rainfall patterns across the broader Caribbean region. This research revealed evidence of severe droughts occurring around 810, 860, and 910 of the Common Era, a pattern of repeated dry periods that would have placed tremendous strain on agricultural systems already operating near their limits. We must pause here to appreciate what drought would have meant in the context of classic Maya society. These were people who had developed sophisticated techniques for water management, including reservoirs and canals and terraced hillsides designed to capture and conserve every precious drop of rain. And yet their agriculture remained fundamentally dependent upon the annual wet season, upon those months of reliable rainfall that allowed maize and beans and squash to grow in sufficient quantities to feed the great urban populations. A single year of poor rainfall could be survived through stored reserves and careful management, but a decade or more of diminished precipitation would have progressively depleted these buffers, leading to food shortages that no amount of royal ritual or political maneuvering could address. And here we must consider the second strand in our rope, which is the matter of the forest itself and what the Maya had done to it over the centuries of their civilization. Studies of ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments have allowed scientists to reconstruct the vegetation history of the Maya lowlands with surprising detail, and the picture that emerges is one of dramatic deforestation during the Classic period. In some regions, the evidence suggests that as much as 96% of the original forest cover had been removed by the time of the collapse. converted to agricultural fields and urban spaces, and, perhaps most significantly, burned to produce the vast quantities of lime plaster that covered Maya buildings and plazas. This deforestation would have had consequences that rippled through the entire environmental system. Trees, through the process of transpiration, return moisture to the atmosphere and help to maintain regional rainfall patterns. And their removal can create what scientists call a positive feedback loop, where reduced forest cover leads to reduced rainfall, which leads to agricultural failure, which leads to the clearing of yet more forest in a desperate attempt to maintain food production. The roots of trees also stabilize soil and slow erosion, and without them, the thin tropical soils of the lowlands would have washed away more quickly, carrying nutrients that had accumulated over millennia into rivers and ultimately into the sea. The practice of slash-and-burn agriculture, which the Maya relied upon for much of their food production, would have contributed to this soil exhaustion over the long term. In this method, forest is cut and burned, and crops are planted in the ash-enriched soil for a few seasons before yields decline, and the farmer moves on to clear a new plot, allowing the original field to regenerate over a period of years or decades. This system can be sustainable when population densities are low and fallow periods are long. But as the classic Maya population grew, the pressure to shorten these fallow periods would have grown as well, leading to progressive degradation of the agricultural base upon which everything else depended. But environmental stress, however severe, does not by itself explain what happened to the classic Maya cities. For human societies are remarkably adaptable when their institutions function well and their leaders make sound decisions. And this brings us to consider the political dimension of the collapse, the ways in which the ruling systems of the classic Maya world were themselves fragmenting and failing during this difficult time. The evidence suggests a process that scholars sometimes call balkanization, a breaking apart of larger political units into smaller competing entities, accompanied by a loss of faith in the divine kingship that had provided ideological legitimacy for the ruling class. The archaeological evidence for intensified warfare during the terminal classic period is substantial and sobering. At Dos Peles, a site in the Pitex-Batun region of Guatemala that had been a powerful kingdom during the late classic period, we can see in the architecture itself the signs of a society increasingly focused on defense rather than display. Fortifications were hastily constructed, using stones torn from the facades of temples and palaces, and the residential areas show evidence of being compressed within defensive walls, as if the population sought safety in numbers behind whatever barriers could be erected. This was not the ritualized warfare of earlier centuries, with its emphasis on the capture of noble prisoners and the assertion of royal prestige, but something more desperate and destructive. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of this violent transition comes from the site of Canquén, located in the upper reaches of the Pasión River in what is now Guatemala. Around 800 of the Common Era, this prosperous trading center met a sudden and violent end that archaeologists have been able to reconstruct in disturbing detail. In a shallow pool that had apparently been hastily converted to a mass grave, researchers discovered the remains of at least 31 individuals, many of them showing signs of violent death, some still adorned with the jade jewelry that marked them as members of the noble class. Among the victims was a man identified through hieroglyphic texts as Can Marks, the king of Canquén, and near him a woman believed to be his queen, both of them apparently executed along with the rest of the royal court in what appears to have been a single catastrophic event. What is particularly striking about Canquén is the manner in which this violence unfolded. The bodies were not left exposed as a warning, as might be expected from conquering enemies. nor were the valuable jade ornaments stripped from the dead. Instead, the victims appear to have been placed in the water with a degree of care that suggests ambivalence on the part of their killers. Perhaps an uprising from within rather than an attack from without. The royal pool became a tomb, and the city itself was abandoned, left to the slow reclamation of the forest that would eventually erase almost all traces of human habitation. And yet we must be careful not to paint too simple a picture, for even as the southern lowland cities were being abandoned, other Maya cities in the northern Yucatan were entering periods of growth and florescence. Oxmal, with its elegant Puuc-style architecture and its carved facades of geometric precision, was thriving during the very decades when cities to the south were falling silent. Chichén Itzá, that remarkable site that blended Maya and Central Mexican influences in ways that scholars still debate, was becoming the dominant power of the northern lowlands, just as the great classic kingdoms of the south dissolved into memory. These northern cities complicate any simple narrative of collapse, reminding us that the Maya world was not a single unified entity, but rather a complex mosaic of regional traditions and local adaptations. The question of what happened to the people themselves, the millions who had inhabited the southern lowland cities during the Classic period, remains one of the more poignant aspects of this transition. For many years, scholars debated whether the collapse involved mass death from famine and disease, or whether the population simply dispersed to other regions where conditions were more favorable. The current consensus leans toward dispersal rather than demographic catastrophe, though the evidence is not entirely clear. People appear to have moved northward to the Yucatan, eastward to the Caribbean coast, and perhaps westward to the highland regions, carrying with them their languages and their traditions and their memories of the great cities they had left behind. And so the great plazas fell silent, and the forest began its patient work of reclamation, sending roots through cracks in the plaster, dropping leaves into the carved mouths of stone masks, raising its green canopy above the temples until they became hills indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The monuments that had recorded the deeds of kings became illegible as their painted plaster weathered away and their carved glyphs eroded in the tropical rains. The knowledge of how to read them was gradually lost as the scribal traditions that had maintained literacy ceased to be practiced, and the histories that had been so carefully recorded became mysteries waiting for future generations to solve. But the Maya themselves did not disappear. Their descendants continued to live throughout the region, maintaining traditions and languages and ways of understanding the world that connected them to their ancestors, even as the great cities slept beneath the forest canopy. The collapse of the classic Maya kingdoms was not the end of Maya civilization, but rather a transformation, a shifting of centers and a reorganization of society that would continue to evolve through the subsequent centuries. The people adapted, as people always do, finding new ways to live in a changed world, carrying forward what they could and letting go of what no longer served them. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated mathematical systems in the ancient world, a system that allowed them to track time across vast spans, to predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy, and to situate their own existence within cycles of creation that stretched back thousands of years before their time and forward into what we might call eternity. And if you find your attention wandering as we explore these numbers and dates together, that is perfectly fine, because the Maya themselves understood that time moves in circles, and whatever you might miss will come around again, as all things do, in their patient and unhurried way. The foundation of Maya mathematics was a base 20 system, which scholars call vigesimal, and this differs from our own familiar base 10 system in ways that are both simple and profound. We count in tens, likely because we have 10 fingers, But the Maya counted in 20s, perhaps because they counted both fingers and toes, or perhaps for reasons we will never fully understand. In their system, the first position held units of 1, the second position held units of 20, the third position held units of 400, which is 20 times 20, and the fourth position held units of 8,000, which is 20 times 400. And so the numbers climbed ever higher in these elegant multiples. The Maya wrote their numbers using only 3 symbols. And here we might pause to appreciate the simplicity of this, for they needed only a dot to represent 1, a horizontal bar to represent 5, and a shell-like glyph to represent something that most ancient civilizations never conceived of at all, which is the concept of zero. The Maya invention of zero was one of the great intellectual achievements in human history, and it was accomplished independently, without any contact with the mathematicians of India, who developed zero in their own tradition. The Maya zero was not merely a placeholder, though it served that function beautifully, but a true mathematical concept, a quantity that represented nothing and yet was essential for representing everything else. Without zero, positional notation becomes impossible, and without positional notation, calculations involving large numbers become unwieldy and prone to error. The Maya understood this, and their shell-shaped zero allowed them to write any number, no matter how large, using their simple system of dots and bars arranged in vertical columns. And this mathematical sophistication was not kept in the hands of a few specialists, but was used throughout Maya society. In markets and temples and scribal schools, wherever people needed to count and calculate and keep track of the passing days. The Maya were deeply concerned with time, not in the anxious way that we modern people sometimes watch the clock, but in a contemplative way, understanding that time itself had qualities and meanings that changed as it flowed. They developed not one calendar, but several, each serving a different purpose. And these calendars interlocked with one another, like the gears of an intricate machine, creating patterns within patterns, cycles within cycles. The first of these calendars was the Solkin, a cycle of 260 days that held deep sacred significance. And this calendar was formed from the combination of 13 numbers and 20 named days, so that each day had both a number and a name, such as 4 Ahau or 7 Emix. The 13 numbers would cycle through repeatedly, while the 20-day names did the same. And since 13 and 20 share no common factors other than 1, the combination would not repeat until both cycles had completed, which required exactly 260 days. Why this particular length was chosen remains a subject of scholarly discussion, with some researchers noting that it approximates the human gestation period, while others point to astronomical cycles or agricultural timing. But whatever its origin, the Solkin was consulted for ritual purposes, for determining auspicious days for ceremonies, and for understanding the character of a person based on their birth date within this sacred round. The second calendar was the Hab, which tracked the solar year through 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short 19th month of only 5 days, creating a total of 365 days. The 18 regular months had names like Pop, Uwo, Zip, and Zots, and each day within a month was numbered from 0 to 19, so that a Hab date might be written as 5 Pop or 12 Yaks. The 5-day month at the end of the year was called Wabe, and these were considered unlucky days, days when the boundary between the mortal world and the spirit world grew thin, and people took precautions during this liminal time. The Hab approximated the true solar year, though it lacked the leap year correction that our Gregorian calendar employs, and so it drifted slowly against the seasons, about 1 day every 4 years. though the Maya were certainly aware of this drift and tracked it through other means. When the Tzolk'in and the harp were used together, they created what scholars call the calendar round, and any given combination of Tzolk'in date and harp date would not repeat for exactly 52 solar years, which is the least common multiple of 260 and 365. This 52-year cycle was of great importance throughout Mesoamerica, and among the Aztec of later centuries, it would be celebrated with elaborate ceremonies when the cycle completed and began anew. But for the Maya, 52 years was not enough, because they wanted to record history and to place events within a framework that extended far beyond a single human lifetime. And so they developed a third system, the one we call the long count, which could track time across millions of years if need be. The long count expressed dates as a series of 5 numbers, counting upward from a fixed starting point that the Maya considered to be the beginning of the current creation. This starting point, when converted to our calendar using what scholars call the GMT correlation, falls on August 11th, 3114 BCE, according to some calculations, or August 13th, 3114 BCE, according to others. And this minor uncertainty of 2 days persists despite decades of research, though either date places us firmly in the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, long before the Maya themselves existed as a recognizable culture. The long count numbers were written from largest to smallest, with the highest unit being the Baktun, a period of 144,000 days, or roughly 394 years, followed by the Katun of 7,200 days, or about 20 years, then the Tun of 360 days, then the Uinal of 20 days, and finally the Kin, which was simply 1 day. A typical long count date might be written as 946.4, 1048.8, meaning 9 Baktuns, 16 Katuns, 4 Tuns, 10 Uinals, and 8 Kins had passed since the creation date. And such a date pinpoints a single day with perfect precision across thousands of years. One of the most magnificent long count inscriptions appears on Stela C at the site of Quirigua, in what is now eastern Guatemala, where the ruler, Cactael Chan Yopat, commissioned a towering monument of red sandstone that displays a complete initial series date along with lengthy mythological texts. This stela, which stands over 10 meters tall and weighs perhaps 65 tons, records the date 9.17.0.0.0, corresponding to January 24th, 771 CE in our calendar, and it connects this date to the mythological creation events, placing the king's reign within a cosmic framework that extends back to the beginning of time itself. The carved surface is covered with hieroglyphic texts in such depth and detail that it took scholars many decades to fully decipher them. And even now, new interpretations continue to emerge as our understanding of Maya writing improves. In the early years of the 21st century, the long count became the subject of widespread popular anxiety because the date 13.0.0.0.0, which represented the completion of 13 Baktuns from the creation date, was approaching, falling on December 21st, 2012. And many people outside scholarly circles came to believe that the Maya had predicted some kind of apocalypse or transformation for this date. This belief was never supported by Maya inscriptions or by the scholars who studied them, and it appears to have originated in modern interpretations that had little to do with ancient Maya thought. The Maya themselves considered the completion of major cycles to be occasions for celebration rather than dread, times when the old order ended and a new order began, and the few inscriptions that do mention the 2012 date speak of it in matter-of-fact terms. At the site of Tortuguero in Tabasco, Mexico, a damaged monument, known as Monument 6, contains a reference to the date, noting that it will witness the descent of a deity called Bolon Yocte Kur. And while the inscription is fragmentary and its full meaning uncertain, nothing in it suggests destruction or catastrophe. The Maya world has seen many back-turn endings before, and life continued, as life does, and the date passed in December 2012 with no ill effects, just as serious scholars had always expected. The Dresden Codex offers perhaps the most impressive demonstration of Maya astronomical sophistication, particularly in its tables tracking the planet Venus, which the Maya associated with warfare and considered deeply significant for timing military campaigns. This accordion-folded manuscript, which survived the colonial period and eventually came to rest in the Saxon State Library in Dresden, Germany, contains page after page of calculations relating to Venus's appearance as morning star and evening star. And when modern astronomers checked these tables against their own calculations, they found that the Maya predictions were accurate to within approximately 2 hours over a span of 5 centuries. This level of precision was achieved without telescopes, without mechanical clocks, without any of the instruments we consider essential for astronomical work, and it speaks to centuries of patient observation, careful record-keeping, and mathematical refinement. The Maya astronomers watched the sky night after night, generation after generation, and their accumulated knowledge allowed them to perceive patterns that would otherwise have remained hidden. The archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni has spent much of his career studying Maya astronomical practices, and his work has helped modern scholars understand how deeply astronomy was integrated into Maya architecture, city planning, and religious thought. Aveni and his colleagues have documented numerous alignments between Maya buildings and celestial events, showing that temples and pyramids were often oriented to mark solstices, equinoxes, and the rising and setting points of Venus, the Pleiades, and other significant celestial objects. These alignments were not coincidental, but intentional, built into the very fabric of Maya cities, so that the urban landscape itself became a kind of calendar, a stone monument to the cycles of the heavens. Aveni's research has also emphasized that Maya astronomy was always embedded within Maya religion and politics, that the observation of celestial events was never a purely scientific exercise in our modern sense, but was always connected to questions of power, legitimacy, and the proper conduct of ritual life. And so we see that Maya mathematics and calendrics were not abstract intellectual exercises, though they were certainly impressive on that level, but were woven into the texture of daily existence, shaping when crops were planted and when rituals were performed, when wars were launched and when kings were crowned. The Maya looked up at the stars and saw not chaos but order, cycles within cycles extending backward to the creation of the world and forward into ages yet to come. Their numbers marched in orderly columns, their calendars meshed like the workings of an infinite machine, and the shell-shaped zero that made it all possible gazed back at them from their manuscripts and monuments, a symbol of nothing that somehow contained everything, an emptiness that was also a presence. The Maya understood that time was not a line rushing towards some final end, but a great wheel turning, and as you feel yourself growing heavier and more relaxed, you might imagine yourself within that wheel, turning slowly, gently, counting the days as they pass, each one following the one before in its appointed place, the numbers cycling endlessly, the calendars meshing, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient dance. In the northern reaches of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the landscape stretches flat and dry beneath a limestone crust, there rose a city that would become perhaps the most visited and most visually iconic of all Maya sites. A place where the ancient and the ceremonial have drawn millions of visitors to stand in wonder beneath a pyramid that seems to embody the very mathematics of the cosmos. And this place is Chichén Itzá, whose name in the Yucatec Maya language means something along the lines of "at the mouth of the well of the Itzá," referring both to the people who inhabited it and to the sacred water source that made life possible in this otherwise parched terrain. And as we settle into this portion of our journey through Maya history, you may find that the gentle rhythm of these ancient stones, laid so carefully one upon another across the centuries, creates a kind of stillness in the mind, a quietude that invites rest and reflection in equal measure. The city of Chichén Itzá experienced its most dramatic florescence during what archaeologists call the Terminal Classic and early Post-Classic periods, roughly spanning from the 9th through the 13th centuries of the Common Era, a time when many of the great southern lowland cities were experiencing their mysterious decline, and the political and cultural centers of Maya civilization were shifting northward into the Yucatan. And Chichén Itzá emerged during this transitional era as a power of remarkable scope and influence, drawing together peoples and traditions from across Mesoamerica into a cosmopolitan center that would leave an indelible mark upon the landscape and the historical memory of the region. And the architecture that remains there today speaks to this period of vibrant synthesis, when ideas and artistic styles flowed across great distances and merged into something both familiar and distinctly new. At the heart of this ancient city, rising above the surrounding plaza with a geometric precision that still moves visitors to quietude and contemplation, stands the structure known as El Castillo, or more properly, the Temple of Kukulkan, named for the feathered serpent deity, who occupied such a central place in the religious imagination of post-classic Mesoamerica. And this stepped pyramid, built sometime around the 11th or 12th century, displays a mathematical sophistication that continues to intrigue scholars and casual observers alike. For each of its four sides bears a staircase of 91 steps, and when you add these 91 steps multiplied by the four sides, you arrive at 364, to which the final platform at the summit adds one more, yielding the total of 365. The number of days in the solar year, and whether this correspondence was fully intentional or partly coincidental, it suggests the profound attention that Maya architects paid to calendrical and astronomical cycles, encoding cosmic time into the very bones of their sacred buildings. Perhaps the most celebrated phenomenon associated with El Castillo occurs twice each year, during the spring and autumn equinoxes, when the late afternoon sun casts a series of triangular shadows along the balustrade of the northern staircase, creating the unmistakable illusion of a serpent's body descending from the temple summit toward the carved serpent head at the staircase's base. And this effect, which draws tens of thousands of visitors to the site each March and September, seems to bring the stone serpent momentarily to life, as if Kukulkan himself were slithering down from the heavens to touch the earth. And while some scholars have debated whether this shadow effect was deliberately planned by the original architects, or represents a later observation that acquired cultural significance, the precision of the alignment and the clarity of the resulting image suggest that Maya builders possessed both the astronomical knowledge and the engineering skill to create such effects with intention. And watching this phenomenon unfold, as the shadows slowly lengthen and connect in the golden light of early evening, produces a sense of awe that transcends the centuries and reminds us how deeply the Maya integrated their understanding of celestial movements into the fabric of daily and ceremonial life. Not far from the Great Pyramid, connected to the ceremonial core by a raised stone pathway called a sakbe, lies the feature that gave Chichén Itzá its name, the Cenote Sagrado, or Sacred Cenote, a natural sinkhole roughly 60 meters in diameter that plunges some 27 meters down to the surface of the dark green water below. And this was no ordinary well from which people drew drinking water, though the city did have other cenotes that served that purpose, but rather a place of pilgrimage and offering, where precious objects and, as the archaeological record would eventually reveal, human beings were deposited as gifts to the rain god Chak and other deities believed to dwell in the watery underworld. And the cenote's sheer limestone walls, draped in vegetation that reaches down toward the still water, create an atmosphere of hushed solemnity, even today, as if the place still holds some memory of the ceremonies once performed at its edge. The sacred cenote captured the imagination of explorers and treasure hunters long before systematic archaeology came to Chichén Itzá. And between the years 1904 and 1910, an American diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Edward Herbert Thompson undertook an ambitious project to dredge the cenote's murky depths, lowering himself in a diving suit to explore the bottom sediments, and bringing to the surface a remarkable collection of offerings that had accumulated over centuries, including objects of carved jade, items of gold and copper that had been fashioned elsewhere in Mesoamerica and brought to this place as precious gifts, bells and discs and ornaments, as well as pottery, textiles, wooden objects preserved by the oxygen-poor conditions of the deep water, and, most solemnly, the skeletal remains of human beings, both adults and children, who had been cast into the waters as sacrificial offerings. And while Thompson's methods would be considered unacceptably crude by modern standards, and many of the objects he retrieved were controversially exported to the Peabody Museum at Harvard, his work confirmed what the indigenous oral traditions had long maintained, that the cenote had served as a focus of profound religious activity for many generations. One of the most debated questions in the study of Chichén Itzá concerns the relationship between the Maya inhabitants of this city and the Toltec civilization centered at the distant site of Tula in central Mexico. For the architecture and iconography of Chichén Itzá include numerous elements that bear striking resemblance to Toltec styles, including the feathered serpent imagery itself, the reclining sculptures known as Chak Muls, the Atlantean columns depicting warrior figures, and the emphasis on military themes and warrior orders. And for much of the 20th century, the prevailing interpretation held that Toltec invaders or migrants from central Mexico had conquered or colonized Chichén Itzá, bringing with them their architectural preferences and religious practices, and imposing a new cultural order upon the Maya population. And this narrative fit comfortably with indigenous historical traditions that spoke of a figure called Kukulkan, the Maya equivalent of the Aztec Quetzalcoatl, who was said to have come from the west and founded a new dynasty at Chichén Itzá. More recent scholarship, however, has complicated this straightforward story of Toltec conquest. For careful analysis of the chronology suggests that some of the supposedly Toltec elements at Chichén Itzá actually predate their appearance at Tula, raising the possibility that the direction of influence might have flowed from the Maya to central Mexico rather than the reverse, or that both regions were participating in a shared Mesoamerican cultural sphere in which ideas, artistic styles, and religious concepts circulated through trade, diplomacy, and pilgrimage rather than through military conquest alone. And this ongoing debate reminds us how much remains uncertain about the political history of the post-classic period, and how archaeological evidence can support multiple interpretations depending on which data one chooses to emphasize. And as you rest and let these scholarly discussions drift gently through your awareness. You may find that the uncertainty itself becomes a kind of comfort, a reminder that the past holds depths we cannot fully plumb, mysteries that remain soft around the edges like shapes seen through water. Among the many structures that reward patient attention at Chichén Itzá, the Great Ball Court stands out for its sheer scale, measuring approximately 168 meters in length, which makes it the largest ball court anywhere in Mesoamerica, dwarfing the courts at other Maya sites and even those in central Mexico. And the playing field stretches between two massive parallel walls that rise to considerable height, each adorned with carved stone panels depicting ball players and, in graphic detail, scenes of human sacrifice associated with the game, including images of decapitated figures from whose necks blood flows in the form of serpents. And standing in this vast enclosed space, which must have held thousands of spectators in ancient times, one becomes aware of curious acoustic properties that continue to puzzle investigators. For a person speaking in a normal voice at one end of the court can be heard with surprising clarity by someone standing at the opposite end, some 150 meters distant, and a handclap at certain points produces multiple echoes that seem to ripple along the walls, effects that may have been intentionally designed to enhance the theatrical and ritual impact of the ceremonies performed there, or may simply be fortuitous consequences of the court's geometry. But either way, they add to the sense of entering a space where ordinary experience becomes subtly altered, hushed and amplified at once. The stone rings that project from the walls high above the playing floor, through which players may have been required to pass a heavy rubber ball using only their hips, shoulders, and knees, speak to the extraordinary athletic skill that the game demanded. And while the exact rules and scoring methods remain subjects of scholarly reconstruction, the ball game clearly held profound cosmological significance across Mesoamerica, serving as a ritual reenactment of the mythological contest between the hero twins and the lords of the underworld, described in the Popol Vuh. And the carved imagery of sacrifice associated with the court suggests that the games played here were not mere entertainment, but ceremonies freighted with religious meaning. Occasions when the boundary between the human and divine worlds grew thin, and the outcome held implications for the cosmic order itself. To the south of the main plaza stands a structure that reveals another dimension of Maya intellectual achievement. The circular building, known as the caracol, a name derived from the Spanish word for snail, referring to the spiral staircase within, though it is more commonly identified as an astronomical observatory. And its round tower, unusual in Maya architecture, contains window openings that align with significant positions of celestial bodies, most notably the planet Venus, whose movements the Maya tracked with extraordinary precision for both calendrical and divinatory purposes. And researchers have identified sight lines through the caracol's apertures that correspond to the extreme northern and southern positions of Venus as a morning or evening star, alignments that would have allowed observers to mark key points in the planet's synodic cycle. And the presence of this dedicated observation facility reminds us that Maya astronomy was not casual stargazing, but a rigorous, institutionalized discipline carried out over generations by specialists who recorded and analyzed celestial data with a dedication that would not be matched in Europe until well into the modern period. In more recent years, new technologies have continued to reveal hidden aspects of Chichén Itzá that remained invisible to earlier investigators. And in 2018, researchers using a technique called electrical resistivity tomography, which measures how electrical current passes through subsurface materials, announced the discovery of a previously unknown cenote located directly beneath El Castillo itself, a water-filled void in the limestone that lies perhaps 15 to 25 meters below the pyramid's foundations. And this finding prompted speculation about whether the Maya builders had been aware of this underground water source and had chosen the location of their most sacred pyramid precisely because of its presence, situating the temple above a symbolic entrance to the watery underworld, where gods and ancestors were believed to dwell. And while much work remains to be done to investigate this hidden cenote without disturbing the structure above, its very existence suggests that Chichén Itzá still holds secrets waiting to be discovered, that beneath the surfaces we can see and touch, there lie depths we have only begun to explore. Adjacent to the Temple of Kukulkan rises another impressive structure known as the Temple of the Warriors, a stepped pyramid fronted by rows of square columns that once supported a roof over a colonnade. And each of these columns bears carved reliefs depicting warriors in regalia, their weapons and costumes indicating the military emphasis that characterized post-classic Chichén Itzá. And at the entrance to the temple, at the summit, reclines one of the Chakmul sculptures that have become so closely associated with this site, a stone figure lying on its back with knees drawn up and head turned to the side, holding on its belly a flat receptacle that may have served to receive offerings. And these enigmatic sculptures, found at both Chichén Itzá and Tula, represent one of the clearest artistic links between Maya and Central Mexican traditions during this period, though their precise ritual function remains a matter of interpretation. And their impassive faces, gazing eternally towards some unseen horizon, seem to watch over the passing centuries with a patience that humans can barely comprehend. The remarkable preservation and accessibility of Chichén Itzá led to its recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988, an acknowledgement of its outstanding universal value as a testament to Maya and Mesoamerican civilization. And nearly 2 decades later, in 2007, the site was selected through a global popular vote as one of the new 7 wonders of the world, joining landmarks such as the Great Wall of China and the Roman Colosseum in a celebration of human architectural achievement that spans cultures and continents. And while such designations inevitably bring challenges of tourism management and conservation, they also ensure that Chichén Itzá will continue to be protected and studied and shared with future generations. Its stones speaking to millions of visitors each year about the ingenuity and devotion of those who built here. And as we prepare to move onward in our journey through Maya history, let the image of the feathered serpent descending in afternoon shadows accompany you into whatever dreams may come. That ancient interplay of light and stone that connected heaven and earth at Chichén Itzá, where the sacred cenote still holds its dark waters and the ball court still echoes with voices from the past, and where, on certain evenings when the crowds have departed and the stones cool in the twilight, one can almost sense the presence of all those who walked these plazas centuries ago, their footsteps now part of the silence that settles over the ruins as the stars emerge one by one above the jungle. And now we come to consider the lives of those who made up the great majority of Maya society, the ordinary people whose days unfolded in patterns of quiet labor and simple contentment, whose names were never carved in stone, whose faces appear only as small figures in murals depicting larger scenes, and yet whose existence formed the very foundation upon which all the grandeur of the cities depended. These were the farmers and the weavers, the potters and the hunters, the mothers who ground maize in the early morning hours, and the fathers who tended gardens in the humid shade of the forest edge. And their lives, though lacking the elaborate ceremonies of the royal courts, possessed their own gentle rhythms and meaningful traditions that we can still trace through the patient work of archaeology. The homes in which common Maya families lived were modest structures, built not of the great limestone blocks that form the temples and palaces, but of more humble materials arranged with considerable skill and care. A typical dwelling began with a low platform of stone, raised perhaps half a meter above the surrounding ground, which served the practical purpose of keeping the living space dry during the rainy season, when water might collect in low areas, and also provided a sense of elevation and separation from the earth below. Upon this platform, the family would construct a framework of wooden poles, often cut from sapodilla or other hardwoods that resisted rot and insects. And these poles would support walls of wattle and daub, a technique involving woven sticks covered with mud plaster that dried to a smooth and surprisingly durable surface. The roof above was thatched with palm fronds, layered thickly in overlapping rows that shed rain quite effectively when properly maintained, and the steep pitch of the roof allowed water to run off quickly, while also creating a high interior space where hot air could rise and dissipate. Our most remarkable window into the daily existence of ordinary Maya people comes from a place called Serpent, located in what is now El Salvador, which has been described by archaeologists as the Pompeii of the Americas due to the extraordinary circumstances of its preservation. Sometime around the year 590 of the Common Era, a nearby volcano called Loma Caldera erupted suddenly and without much warning, sending waves of volcanic ash cascading over this small farming village and burying it to a depth of several meters. The residents, it seems, fled in haste when they felt the first tremors or saw the initial plumes of smoke, leaving behind their possessions, their half-eaten meals, their tools laid down in the middle of tasks, and all the small objects of their daily lives. The ash that covered Serpent was remarkably fine-grained and settled gently, preserving organic materials that would ordinarily decay completely within a few years, including thatched roofs, wooden beams, stored food, woven mats, and even the impressions of plants growing in household gardens. The excavations at Chichén have revealed details of common Maya life that we could never have known from sites where only stone and pottery survive. We can see, for instance, that families stored their maize in large ceramic vessels, and that they kept obsidian blades and bone tools close at hand for everyday tasks. We can observe the arrangement of sleeping areas within houses, with raised platforms along the walls where mats would have been unrolled each evening. We can examine the remains of meals left in bowls on the floor, and from the placement of objects around the living space, we can begin to understand how families organize their daily routines within these modest but comfortable dwellings. The houses at Chichén were typically organized in small clusters, with several structures grouped around a shared patio, where much of the family's work would have taken place in the open air, and this pattern of domestic arrangement appears to have been common throughout the Maya world. The diet of ordinary Maya people centered upon maize, that remarkable grain which had been domesticated thousands of years earlier and had become so fundamental to Maya culture that it featured prominently in their creation myths, where the gods were said to have fashioned human beings from maize dough. The preparation of maize involved a process that we now call nixtamalization, though the Maya themselves would have known it simply as the way one properly prepares corn. Dried maize kernels were soaked overnight in water mixed with lime, which could be obtained by burning limestone or seashells, and this alkaline solution softened the tough outer hull of the kernel, while also triggering chemical changes that made the nutrients within more accessible to human digestion. The soaked kernels were then ground on a stone metate, a slightly concave grinding surface, using a cylindrical stone called a mano, and this grinding transformed the kernels into a smooth dough that could be shaped into tortillas or tamales, or stirred into beverages. Alongside maize, the common Maya diet included black beans, which provided protein and complemented the nutritional profile of the grain quite effectively, and squash in its various forms, whose seeds could be dried and ground into sauces or eaten as snacks. Wild game supplemented these staples when hunters were successful, and the forests provided deer, peccaries, rabbits, and various birds, while rivers and coastal areas offered fish and shellfish to those who lived nearby. Turkey was domesticated by the Maya, as was a small hairless dog that was raised for food in some regions, though the extent of dog consumption remains a matter of some scholarly discussion. The diet varied considerably, depending on local conditions, with coastal communities eating quite differently from those in the interior highlands. But the fundamental importance of maize remained constant across all regions and all social classes. Among the most treasured elements of Maya cuisine was cacao, the bean from which chocolate is made, and the evidence suggests that this precious substance was consumed not only by elites in ceremonial contexts, but also by ordinary people in their daily lives. Archaeologists have detected the chemical signatures of cacao in the residues found inside common household pottery, indicating that chocolate drinks were prepared and enjoyed in humble dwellings as well as royal palaces. The Maya prepared their cacao as a frothy beverage, mixing ground cacao beans with water and often adding chili peppers, which gave the drink a pleasing warmth, or maize flour, which made it more substantial and filling. The drink was poured repeatedly from one vessel to another, from a height, to create the prized foam that was considered the most delicious part. They called this preparation exocalatl, a word that would eventually make its way, somewhat transformed, into nearly every language on Earth, and the fondness of the Maya for this drink cannot be overstated. Within each household, there existed a shrine where the family would make offerings and communicate with the supernatural forces that influenced their lives. These domestic shrines were typically small niches or platforms where figurines of deities could be placed, along with offerings of food, incense, and perhaps small quantities of the family's blood, obtained through the pricking of fingers or earlobes with obsidian blades. The practice of household religion allowed ordinary people to maintain their own relationship with the divine, independent of the great ceremonies conducted by priests at the temples, and the evidence from excavations suggests that these private devotions were an important part of daily life. Copal incense, made from the resin of certain trees, would have filled the home with its distinctive sweet smoke during these moments of prayer and offering, creating an atmosphere of quiet reverence. The household garden, known in the Maya language as the pet cot, was an essential feature of domestic life and represented a sophisticated approach to food production that went far beyond simple cultivation. These gardens were typically located immediately around the dwelling, where they could be easily tended and where household waste could be recycled as fertilizer. And they contained a remarkable diversity of useful plants arranged in careful layers. Fruit trees provided shade and sustenance, with avocado and papaya and breadnut growing above a middle layer of smaller shrubs and a ground layer of vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants. The gardens at Chichén, preserved beneath the volcanic ash, have revealed rows of maize and maguey plants, the latter being useful for its fibers as well as its fermented sap. And the careful arrangement of these plants speaks to generations of accumulated knowledge about which species grew well together and how to maximize production in a limited space. The marketplace economy connected ordinary Maya households to a broader network of exchange that spanned considerable distances. We can trace these economic connections through the distribution of obsidian, a volcanic glass that was essential for making the sharp cutting tools that every household required. Obsidian does not occur naturally in most parts of the Maya lowlands, and so it had to be imported from highland sources, some of which were hundreds of kilometers away. And yet, obsidian blades are found in even the most modest dwellings. The patterns of obsidian distribution suggest that there were regular markets where common people could obtain this material, probably by trading surplus agricultural products or craft goods. And these markets served as gathering places where news was exchanged and social bonds were maintained. Women in ordinary Maya households devoted considerable time to the production of textiles, working with cotton or maggi fibers on backstrap, looms that were simple in construction but capable of producing cloth of remarkable quality and complexity. The backstrap loom consists essentially of a series of sticks and bars that hold the threads in tension while the weaver manipulates them, with one end of the loom attached to a post or tree, and the other end wrapped around the weaver's lower back by means of a strap. By leaning forward or backward, the weaver can tighten or loosen the tension on the threads, and by passing the shuttle back and forth through the warp threads, she gradually builds up the fabric row by row. This technology, which remains in use among Maya communities today, allowed for the creation of intricate patterns and designs. And textiles served not only as clothing, but also as items of trade and as gifts to cement social relationships. Among the practices that may seem unusual to modern sensibilities, but were considered perfectly normal and indeed desirable among the ancient Maya, was the deliberate modification of the skull during infancy. Maya parents would bind the soft skulls of their babies between flat boards, applying gentle but persistent pressure over a period of months, which gradually encouraged the skull to grow into an elongated shape that was considered beautiful and proper. This practice, known as cranial modification, left permanent changes to the bone structure that archaeologists can observe in skeletal remains, and the prevalence of modified skulls across all social classes suggests that this was a widespread custom rather than one limited to elites. The elongated forehead that resulted from this practice may have been seen as evoking the shape of a maize cob, connecting the human form to the sacred grain that sustained all life. Another form of bodily decoration involved the permanent alteration of teeth, which were sometimes filed into various shapes or drilled to allow the insertion of small pieces of jade or other precious stones. The drilling of teeth required considerable skill, as the procedure had to penetrate the enamel and create a small cavity without cracking the tooth or causing an infection, and the adhesive used to secure the inlays had to be strong enough to hold them in place for years of normal use. Evidence of dental decoration appears across social classes, though the materials used for inlays varied, with jade being reserved for those of higher status, while pyrite or obsidian might adorn the teeth of more common individuals. The keeping of stingless bees, particularly of the genus Melipona, was another aspect of ordinary Maya life that deserves mention, as these small creatures provided honey that was valued not only as a sweetener, but also as an ingredient in medicines and in the preparation of a fermented beverage called balche, which was consumed during certain religious ceremonies. Unlike the honeybees familiar in other parts of the world, the native stingless bees of Mesoamerica produce their honey in small pots within their hives, and the Maya developed techniques for keeping these bees in hollowed logs that could be stacked and managed conveniently. This tradition of Melipona beekeeping has continued without interruption in some Maya communities down to the present day, representing one of the most enduring connections between ancient practice and modern life. As we consider the daily existence of ordinary Maya people, we find lives that were filled with purposeful labor and quiet satisfaction, with the rhythms of planting and harvest, with the warmth of family gathered around the hearth, with the comfort, familiar traditions passed from parent to child across countless generations. These were lives lived in connection with the land and the forest, with the gods who watched over the crops and the ancestors who had gone before. And though the great cities have long since fallen silent, and the forest has reclaimed the plazas, where lords once walked in splendor. The descendants of those ordinary Maya farmers still tend their gardens and grind their maize and weave their cloth in patterns that would be recognizable to their distant ancestors. The Maya understood their universe as a structure of extraordinary complexity and quiet order, a layered cosmos in which the living and the dead, the earthly and the divine, existed in perpetual relationship with one another. To comprehend the depth of Maya religious thought is to enter a world where every cave mouth suggested a doorway to another realm, where every great tree reached both toward the heavens and down into the waters beneath the earth, and where the journey of the sun across the sky was understood, not merely as a physical phenomenon, but as a sacred narrative enacted each day and each night, forever and without ceasing. The Maya conceived of their universe as consisting of three primary realms, stacked one upon the other in a vertical arrangement that connected all living things to the powers above and below. The uppermost realm was the heavens, a multi-layered domain, sometimes described as containing 13 distinct levels, each presided over by its own deities and celestial beings. Here moved the sun and the moon, the planets in their wandering courses, and the fixed stars that wheeled slowly through the darkness of the night sky. The Maya tracked these movements with remarkable precision, as we have discussed in earlier passages, and they understood the celestial realm as a place of tremendous power, a region from which divine influence descended to touch the middle world of human habitation. This middle realm, the surface of the earth upon which people built their cities and tended their fields, was imagined as a great flat expanse, sometimes depicted as the back of an enormous caiman or crocodile floating upon the primordial waters. The four cardinal directions held deep significance, each associated with particular colors and particular meanings. And at the center of this earthly plane stood the great world tree, the axis mundi that connected all three realms of existence. The Maya identified this cosmic tree with the Ceiba, the towering kapok tree that grows throughout the tropical lowlands and can reach heights of 70 meters or more. With its massive buttressed trunk and its spreading branches that seem to hold up the very sky, the Ceiba represented the living connection between the underworld, the surface of the earth, and the highest heavens. Its roots plunged down into the watery darkness below. Its trunk rose through the world of human beings, and its crown touched the celestial realm above. In Maya art and architecture, this world tree appears again and again, sometimes shown with a great bird perched in its uppermost branches, sometimes depicted with its roots entwined around skulls and bones, reminding the viewer that life and death were bound together in an endless cycle. Below the surface of the earth, beneath the roots of the world tree and the waters that surrounded the earthly realm, lay Xibalba, the place of fright, the kingdom of the dead. The Maya understood Xibalba not as a simple afterlife destination, but as a complex and dangerous domain, a place of trials and terrors ruled by fearsome deities who delighted in the suffering of those who entered their realm. Caves and cenotes, those natural sinkholes that pierce the limestone bedrock of the Yucatan, were understood as entrances to Xibalba, and the Maya approached these openings with reverence and caution, leaving offerings and conducting rituals at the boundaries between the world of the living and the world below. The very word Xibalba suggests fear and trembling, and the myths that surrounded this underworld spoke of a place filled with houses of darkness, houses of jaguars, houses of razor-sharp blades, and rivers of blood and pus through which the dead must pass. Our most complete understanding of Maya beliefs concerning Xibalba comes from a remarkable document known as the Popol Vuh, sometimes translated as the Book of the Council or the Book of the Community. This text preserves the creation mythology and heroic narratives of the Kishmaya, a highland group whose descendants still live today in the mountains of Guatemala. The Popol Vuh, as we know it, was transcribed in the early 18th century, around the year 1702, by a Dominican friar named Francisco Ximenez, who was serving in the town of Chichicastenango in the Guatemalan highlands. Ximenez copied a Kaqui text that had itself been written down sometime in the mid-16th century, shortly after the Spanish conquest, using the Latin alphabets that the Maya had learned from the friars. The original hieroglyphic or painted version of this narrative, if such a document ever existed, has been lost to time, but the alphabetic version that Ximenez preserved has allowed scholars to reconstruct the mythological framework within which the ancient Maya understood their world. The Popol Vuh begins with the creation of the universe itself, describing how the gods brought forth the earth from the primordial waters, how they raised the mountains and filled the valleys with trees and plants, and how they populated the world with animals of every kind. The gods desired beings who would honor them and remember them, who would keep the days of the calendar and offer praise and sustenance to their creators. Their first attempts at creating humans proved unsuccessful, as figures made of mud dissolved, and figures made of wood lacked proper understanding and devotion. Eventually, the gods succeeded in fashioning true human beings from maize dough, corn being the sacred substance that the Maya considered the very foundation of human life. These first true people, the ancestors of all humanity, possessed knowledge and wisdom, and they honored the gods as the gods desired to be honored. Yet before this creation of humanity, the Popol Vuh tells of an earlier age and earlier beings, and it recounts the adventures of two young heroes whose journey into Xibalba forms the narrative heart of the text. These hero twins, known as Hunahpu and Palenque, were summoned to the underworld by the Lords of Death, who had grown annoyed by the noise of the twins playing the sacred ball game on the surface of the earth above. The Lords of Xibalba, beings with names like One Death and Seven Death, Blood Gatherer and Pus Master, Bone Scepter and Skull Scepter, were cruel and cunning, delighting in trickery and demanding impossible tasks from any who entered their realm. The father and uncle of the hero twins had previously descended into Xibalba and had failed its tests, losing their lives to the deceptions of the Death Lords. But the twins themselves proved more clever, more resourceful, and possessed of a divine cunning that allowed them to survive each trap and triumph over each challenge. The twins passed through the rivers of blood and pus. They survived the houses of darkness and blades and jaguars and bats, and they defeated the Lords of Xibalba, not through force of arms, but through intelligence and misdirection. In one memorable episode, the twins allowed themselves to be killed and their bones ground to powder and thrown into a river, knowing that they would be reborn from the waters and return in disguise. They appeared before the Death Lords as wandering performers, amazing the Underworld's rulers with their magical feats, including the ability to sacrifice one another and then restore the slain twin to life. The Lords of Death, eager to experience this wonder for themselves, demanded that the twins sacrifice them and bring them back to life as well. The twins obliged, sacrificing One Death and Seven Death, but of course they did not resurrect them. In this way, through wit rather than warfare, the hero twins defeated the rulers of Xibalba and diminished the power of death itself over the living world. The story of the hero twins was not merely a tale told for entertainment, though it certainly served that purpose as well. It was a sacred narrative that explained the relationship between life and death, between the surface of the earth and the realm below, between human beings and the powers that govern their fate. The ball game that the twins played was understood as a reenactment of this cosmic struggle, and the great ball courts that archaeologists have found at Maya sites throughout Mesoamerica were understood as liminal spaces, where this mythological drama could be performed again and again. The players on these courts were not merely athletes, but ritual participants, their movements echoing the movements of the hero twins, their competition representing the eternal contest between the forces of life and the forces of death. The rubber ball itself, bouncing and rolling across the stone floor of the court, represented the movement of celestial bodies, particularly the sun, which the Maya understood as descending into Xibalba each night and rising triumphant each morning, just as the hero twins had descended and returned. The jaguar held a special place in this cosmological framework, for the Maya understood this great spotted cat as the night sun itself, the form that the sun took when it traveled through the underworld during the hours of darkness. By day, the sun moved across the heavens as a radiant and life-giving force, but when it sank below the western horizon, it entered Xibalba and was transformed into the jaguar, padding silently through the darkness until it emerged once more in the east at dawn. Maya rulers frequently associated themselves with the jaguar, adopting names and titles that invoke this powerful creature, wearing jaguar pelts and sitting upon jaguar skin thrones. To be identified with the jaguar was to claim kinship with the sun itself, to assert one's ability to travel between realms and to emerge triumphant from the darkness of death. The Maya elite maintained their connection to the gods and to the underworld through elaborate rituals of blood sacrifice, understanding that the gods required sustenance and that human blood was the most precious offering that could be given. The practice of bloodletting was central to Maya royal and priestly ritual, and it involved piercing the body with sharp implements to draw forth sacred blood, which was then offered to the gods through burning or other means. The implements used for this purpose included the spines of stingrays, imported from the Caribbean coast to inland cities that lay hundreds of kilometers from the sea, as well as finely crafted blades of obsidian, the volcanic glass that could be knapped to an edge sharper than any modern surgical steel. Some of the most vivid evidence for these bloodletting practices comes from the site of Yaxchilan, a city located on the banks of the Usumacinta River in what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas. There, a series of carved stone lintels, the horizontal beams that span doorways in Maya architecture, depict scenes of royal ritual with extraordinary precision and detail. Lintel 24, in particular, shows a queen known as Lady Suk, wife of the powerful king Shield Jaguar, engaged in a bloodletting ritual of intense devotion. The carving shows Lady Suk drawing a thorned rope through her tongue, allowing her blood to drip onto paper strips held in a basket below. In another lintel, she is shown experiencing a vision induced by this painful offering, as a great vision serpent rises from the blood-soaked papers, and from its open jaws emerges a divine figure, perhaps an ancestor or a deity, come to communicate with the mortal queen. These images remind us that bloodletting was not mere self-mutilation, but a technology of transcendence, a means by which the Maya elite sought to pierce the veil between the human world and the realm of the sacred. Vision quests and altered states of consciousness were central to Maya religious practice, and the Maya made use of various substances to facilitate these experiences of divine communion. Morning glory seeds, containing compounds related to lysergic acid, were consumed to induce visionary states. Certain species of mushrooms containing psilocybin were employed in similar fashion, and there is evidence that the Maya collected and used the toxic secretions of the bufo toad, which contain powerful psychoactive compounds. These substances were not used recreationally, but ritually, under the guidance of trained shamans and priests who understood how to navigate the dangerous waters of altered consciousness and return safely to ordinary awareness. Caves played a crucial role in Maya religious life, serving as natural temples where worshippers could enter the very body of the earth and approach the threshold of Xibalba itself. One of the most remarkable of these cave sites is Aktun Chunichilmukno, located in the interior of modern-day Belize. This cave system extends deep into the limestone hills, its passages gradually narrowing as one moves further from the entrance, until one reaches chambers where the ancient Maya conducted rituals of tremendous solemnity. Within these inner chambers, archaeologists have found pottery vessels, stone tools, and the remains of human sacrifices, individuals whose lives were offered to the powers of the underworld. The most famous of these remains is a skeleton that has become known as the Crystal Maiden, a young person whose bones have become completely calcified by the mineral-rich waters that have dripped upon them for more than 1,000 years. The skeleton lies where it was placed in antiquity, the bones gleaming with a crystalline coating that catches any light and seems almost to glow in the darkness of the cave. This individual, whether male or female, was given to Xibalba in an act of ultimate devotion, and the body remains there still, a permanent offering in the perpetual darkness below the earth. The Maya cosmos, then, was a living structure in which the realms of existence were connected by sacred trees and cave passages, by the movements of celestial bodies and the journeys of mythological heroes, by the flow of blood and the visions that blood could summon. To be Maya was to understand oneself as situated within this vast and ordered universe, connected to the powers above and below, responsible for maintaining the rituals and offerings that kept the cosmos in motion. The dead were not gone, but merely dwelling in another realm, and the gods were not distant, but present in every sunrise and every storm, in every cave mouth and every towering ceiba tree. The journey to Xibalba was not merely a story, but a truth about the nature of existence, a reminder that death was not an ending, but a passage, and that even the lords of death themselves could be outwitted by those who possessed courage and cleverness and the blessing of the gods. And so we come now to the present day, to the living descendants of those remarkable cities we have wandered through together, those temple complexes rising from the jungle floor, those causeways stretching between ancient centers of learning and ceremony. For the Maya did not vanish, as older textbooks sometimes carelessly suggested, and their civilization did not simply collapse into silence and forgetting. Rather, millions of Maya people continue to live across the lands their ancestors shaped, speaking languages that have flowed through families for countless generations, maintaining traditions that connect the present moment to a past stretching back thousands of years, and simultaneously engaging with the complexities and challenges of the modern world in ways that demonstrate both resilience and ongoing cultural vitality. Approximately 7 million Maya people live today across a region spanning several nations, their communities distributed through the highlands and lowlands of Guatemala, through the southern states of Mexico, including Chiapas, Yucatan, Campeche, and Quintana Roo, through the forests and coastlands of Belize, and into the western reaches of Honduras. These modern political boundaries, drawn by colonial powers and maintained through subsequent centuries, cut across territories that Maya peoples have inhabited continuously since long before any European arrived on these shores. And the Maya population today represents one of the largest indigenous groups in the Americas. In Guatemala alone, Maya people comprise roughly half the national population, a demographic reality that has shaped the country's history in profound and often painful ways. While in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, Maya communities maintain strong cultural identities despite centuries of pressure toward assimilation. The linguistic heritage of the Maya remains remarkably vibrant, with more than 30 distinct Maya languages still spoken by communities across this region, each language carrying within it particular ways of understanding the world, particular modes of expression, particular connections to specific landscapes and local histories. The Quiche language, spoken by over 1 million people, primarily in the Guatemalan highlands, represents one of the largest of these linguistic communities. And it was in Quiche that the Popol Vuh, that great creation narrative, was recorded in the 16th century using the alphabetic script introduced by Spanish missionaries. Yucatec Maya remains strong in the peninsula that gives it its name, spoken by hundreds of thousands of people whose ancestors built the great cities of Chichén Itzá and Uxmal, while Quechua, another major Maya language, thrives in both Guatemala and Belize. Other languages, such as Mam, Sutujil, Cacchical, and Tzotzil, each maintain their own communities of speakers, their own literary traditions, and their own programs of preservation and education, though some smaller Maya languages face significant endangerment as younger generations shift towards Spanish or other dominant languages. The modern history of Maya peoples has been marked by struggle and by suffering, particularly during the Guatemalan Civil War that stretched from 1960 to 1996, 3.5 decades of conflict that brought devastating violence to Maya communities throughout the highlands and beyond. Government forces engaged in counterinsurgency campaigns against leftist guerrilla movements, targeted Maya villages with particular brutality, destroying over 400 communities entirely and displacing hundreds of thousands of people who fled to refugee camps in Mexico or scattered through the mountains attempting to survive. The violence reached its most concentrated horror in the early 1980s, when the military regime of General Efraín Ríos Montt pursued what has since been legally recognized as genocide against the Ixil Maya people of the Quiché Department. The 1999 report by the United Nations-sponsored Commission for Historical Clarification documented these events in careful and painful detail, recording massacres, forced disappearances, torture, sexual violence, and the deliberate destruction of Maya cultural and spiritual practices as part of a systematic campaign to eliminate perceived opposition. The UN Commission found that over 200,000 people were killed or disappeared during the war, the vast majority of them Maya civilians, and that state forces were responsible for 93% of documented human rights violations. The Ixil Maya genocide, recognized by a Guatemalan court in 2013, when former General Ríos Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, though the conviction was later annulled on procedural grounds before being reinstated in a retrial completed after his death, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented cases of genocide in Latin American history. The trauma of this period continues to shape Maya communities today, with ongoing efforts to identify remains in mass graves, to provide justice for survivors, and to ensure that the historical record preserves the truth of what occurred. It was against this backdrop of violence and marginalization that Quiche Maya activist Rigoberta Menchú emerged as an internationally recognized voice for indigenous rights. Born in 1959 in the village of Chimel in the Guatemalan highlands, Menchú witnessed the violent deaths of her father, mother, and brother during the Civil War, experiences she described in a testimonial narrative that brought global attention to the plight of Guatemala's indigenous peoples. In 1992, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of her work on behalf of indigenous rights, becoming the first indigenous woman and the youngest person at that time to receive the prize. The award came during the quincentenary year of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, and the Nobel Committee explicitly noted that the prize was given in recognition of Menchu's efforts for social justice and ethno-cultural reconciliation based on respect for the rights of indigenous peoples. Her advocacy helped bring international pressure to bear on the Guatemalan government and contributed to the eventual peace accords signed in 1996. In Mexico, Maya communities in the state of Chiapas had experienced their own long history of marginalization and exploitation. Their lands appropriated by large landowners, their labor extracted under conditions that recalled colonial-era encomienda systems, their political voices suppressed by a one-party state that maintained control for most of the 20th century. On the 1st of January 1994, the day the North American Free Trade Agreement came into effect, an armed uprising led by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, known by its Spanish initials as the EZLN, seized several towns in Chiapas and demanded recognition of indigenous rights, land reform, and democratic transformation. The Zapatista movement drew its leadership and membership primarily from Maya communities, including Tzotzil, Zeltal, Tojolabal, and Chol peoples, and their spokesperson, the masked figure known as Subcomandante Marcos, articulated demands that resonated with indigenous communities across Mexico and indeed throughout the world. Though a ceasefire was quickly arranged and the expected military annihilation of the rebels did not occur, largely due to massive domestic and international protest, the underlying issues the Zapatistas raised about indigenous autonomy, economic justice, and political inclusion continue to define debates in Mexican society, and the Zapatista communities in Chiapas maintain their autonomous governance structures to this day. Alongside these struggles for survival and recognition, a quiet renaissance has been taking place in Maya scholarship and cultural revival, with Maya people themselves increasingly taking leading roles in the study and interpretation of their own heritage. The archaeologist Héctor Escobedo of Guatemala has contributed significantly to our understanding of ancient Maya political organization and the archaeological record of sites including Piedras Negras, bringing both professional training and cultural perspective to the interpretation of monuments and inscriptions that his ancestors created. Other Maya scholars work across disciplines, from linguistics to anthropology to history, challenging earlier frameworks that positioned Maya people as passive objects of study rather than active interpreters of their own past and present. This shift toward indigenous participation in scholarship has transformed the field, bringing new questions, new methodologies, and new understandings that emerge from cultural knowledge maintained within Maya communities. The Academia de Lenguas Mayas de Guatemala, established in 1990 under Guatemalan law as an autonomous institution responsible for the preservation and development of Maya languages, represents an important institutional expression of this cultural revitalization. The Academy conducts research on all 22 Maya languages spoken in Guatemala, develops standardized orthographies and educational materials, trains teachers for bilingual education programs, and advocates for linguistic rights at the national and international level. Similar institutions and programs exist in Mexico and Belize, each working to ensure that Maya languages continue to be learned by new generations, that literature and educational materials are available in indigenous languages, and that the linguistic heritage of the Maya remains a living presence rather than merely a subject of academic study. Perhaps most remarkably, the ancient Maya script itself has become a subject of revival among some contemporary Maya communities, with workshops and educational programs teaching the hieroglyphic writing system that scribes once used to record the deeds of kings and the movements of celestial bodies. This revival draws upon the decipherment work completed by scholars over the past several decades, transforming academic knowledge into a resource for cultural reclamation. Young Maya people learning to read and write the glyphs of their ancestors are engaging in an act of cultural reconnection that would have seemed impossible only a few generations ago, when the script was still largely undeciphered and when official policy in many places actively suppressed indigenous languages and cultural expressions. Traditional practices continue in Maya communities today, maintained through centuries of colonial rule and national neglect, adapted to changing circumstances, but preserving essential connections to ancestral ways of understanding time, cosmos, and human relationship to the natural world. Day keeper, calendar priests, known as Achikijijab in Kehich or similar terms in other Maya languages, continue to track the sacred 260-day calendar, using it to determine auspicious dates for ceremonies, to provide guidance for individuals seeking understanding of their destiny, and to maintain the ritual cycle that structures community spiritual life. These calendar keepers underwent initiation and training, learning from elder practitioners the complex calculations and interpretive traditions that allow them to serve their communities, and they perform ceremonies at ancient sites and modern shrines alike, burning copal incense and presenting offerings, much as their predecessors did centuries ago. The weaving traditions of Maya women, particularly in the Guatemalan highlands, preserve cosmological knowledge within intricate patterns of thread and color, encoding symbols of the cosmos, of local identity, and of spiritual significance within textiles that serve both practical and ceremonial purposes. The hupil, the traditional blouse worn by Maya women, displays designs specific to particular communities, allowing those who understand the visual language to recognize immediately where a weaver comes from and what traditions she maintains. These patterns connect contemporary weavers to ancient precedents visible in stone sculptures and ceramic figurines from classic period cities, demonstrating a continuity of aesthetic expression and symbolic communication spanning more than a millennium. The Wabe ceremonies, observed during the 5 unnamed days at the end of the 365-day solar calendar, continue to mark a period of special spiritual significance, when the boundary between the human world and other realms grows thin and particular care must be taken in behavior and observance. These days, considered dangerous and liminal in traditional understanding, require specific rituals and restrictions, and their continued observation demonstrates how the Maya calendrical system persists not merely as an object of scholarly interest, but as a living framework for organizing time and religious practice. The question of what belongs to whom, what should be returned, and what should remain where it currently resides, has increasingly entered public discourse regarding Maya artifacts held in Western museums, carved stelae, painted ceramics, jade ornaments, and architectural fragments removed from Maya sites during the 19th and 20th centuries, now reside in institutions across Europe and North America, where they serve educational purposes, but remain separated from the communities and landscapes of their origin. Guatemala and Mexico have both pursued repatriation claims for specific objects, with varying degrees of success, and the broader ethical questions about colonial-era acquisitions and their contemporary significance continue to generate discussion among museum professionals, government officials, and indigenous advocates. These debates connect the Maya past to present-day questions of cultural property, colonial legacy, and the rights of descendant communities to control their own heritage. As we rest with these thoughts of continuity and persistence, of trauma and recovery, of languages maintained and scripts revived, we might allow ourselves to appreciate the simple fact that the Maya civilization is not a completed story, Not a chapter closed and concluded, but an ongoing narrative in which millions of people continue to participate. The cities in the jungle, the temples rising above the forest canopy, the inscriptions recording ancient events, all of these connect to living communities who understand themselves as heirs to this tradition, who speak languages descended from those of the ancient scribes, who maintain calendrical and ceremonial practices, linking them to ancestral ways of being in the world. This continuity, stretching across centuries of disruption and displacement, represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Maya civilization: the persistence of culture through time, the transmission of knowledge across generations, the survival and renaissance of an ancient people whose story continues to unfold.